Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Lincoln University and our Innovation Series event today. We especially put the wetter weather on, so you wouldn't be missing out by coming here. Today's session is water, soil and biodiversity building farming systems that maintain ecosystem services. It's a subject that I'm quite interested in and quite keen on, so I'm delighted to be here today myself. So just a few health and safety requirements and sort of service announcements. We're not expecting any drills, so if the alarms sound, just head out the door and up to Forbes lawn that way. Myself and my helper here, Katie, will show you the way. If you need the toilets, either nip out the back and down the stairs or out the door on the left, and they're just behind this lecture theatre. We'll have 3 sessions today. And after the first session, there'll be a morning tea break. After the second session, it'll just be a quick toilet break, a stand-up break, and then straight into the third session. And then after the third session, there'll be lunch. So we're looking at how innovation and sustainability shaping the future of farming systems. It's something that is requested by our customers, our processors, our markets, our global markets. So how can New Zealand farmers contribute and continue to produce food that meets the requirements of our markets, whilst also protecting the very resource that we rely on to produce that food and fibre? So water quality, soil health, biodiversity, they are core to our business. They have been core to our business and will be core going forward. As a little aside, I'm part of a new project with Lincoln University and McCain Foods looking at regenerative farming practice. We're just establishing that project. And the reason New Zealand has been chosen is because McCain Foods see us as ahead of the game in terms of what else is happening around the world, and we can push the boundaries even further, bringing in that sustainability, that innovation. So today we won't be talking any more about that. That'll be something for the future. Today it brings together researchers, industry leaders, farmers to share practical tools, real world insights and future thinking that can help align our profitable production systems with environmental stewardship. So I'm getting myself a little ahead of schedule, but knowing academics and researchers, they will fill the gaps. So I will hand over to my colleague, Dr. Al Black from Lincoln University. He looks at the resilient pasture side and productive soils. So I'll hand over to you, Al.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alison. Yes, I'm Alistair Black, and what I want to take the opportunity this morning is to give you an insight to what I've been doing over the last 4 or 5 years, and that has been developing the university's first Regen Ag experiment, where we utilise the principles around diverse pasture systems and legume-based systems as well, to try to maintain productivity and other ecosystem services for our dryland farmers. So the East Coast region, where rainfall is inclement and there's often a summer water limitation, and we need to develop resilient pasture-based systems to make those farmlands thrive. And they are primarily based on legumes. So my brief was to talk a summary around in the lines of pasture diversity, ecosystem services. In this context, the primary ecosystem service is on the animal production space. So new data from the Whenua Hamanu Regenerative Ag dryland experiments, we call it the RAID in my group, and it's a 7-year project funded mainly through MPI, and it started formally in 2022 and will run until 2029. And I went early and got some sites started in the year prior. So we've got about 4 or 5 years of data already. Our primary research questions are, well, what is the total farm impact? So dealing with the soil, plant, animal primarily, and also the financial impacts of a regen ag system. And we're repeating that across 2 levels of soil fertility with a view of quantifying the total farm impact of primarily soil phosphorus availability, going back to getting more from less sort of principles, improving efficiency of our farm systems, and fertilizer, in particular phosphate fertilizer, is one of the main inputs of our livestock production farms. But importantly, looking at that interaction. So does the impact of the regen ag system depend upon soil P availability? So can this system perform better, or if not, maintain production at low inputs of soil phosphorus fertilizer levels? And through these things take time, don't they, to develop a system and get that system affecting whatever is happening below ground. And during that time, I'm quite interested in looking at the efficiencies of production. So can we optimize the conversion efficiency of whatever inputs that we put into the system, whether they be natural resources, primarily light interception, water, nutrient availability, nitrogen availability, etc., and converting those resources into animal products. So these are new data, and I've run some calculations in the lines of efficiencies of those main natural resources. So back in 2021, I acquired about 10 hectares of prime land on the university campus before it went into houses. And that is based at what was the horticulture research unit, or the hort research area. And it's close to our biological husbandry unit, also on campus as well. So within that 10-hectare block, I developed 4 autonomous or fully contained farmlets of 2 hectares each. And we are doing the direct comparison of a regen ag system against what we call a conventional system based on legumes. So in the regen system, we when you listen to practitioners of regen ag in this country, they're interested in hyper-diverse pastures or diverse pastures in terms of plant species, with a view that mixing different species from different functional groups will improve whatever ecosystem service we're interested in, primarily animal production to meet the bottom line, but also other services as well. So I established multi-species pastures based on grasses, herbs and legumes that were available commercially, as well as winter forage crops, and keeping in the theme of diversity might be better for the winter annual forage crops to help feed livestock through the winter. We've got some multi-species graze crops in there as well. And also well-managed rotational grazing systems, so moving animals, in this case sheep, from paddock to paddock, with a view of having a high density of animals on a pasture for a short period of time and moving them on frequently. And the conventional system is based on our main results from our other dryland pasture research program, which basically says they should be legume based to make the most out of the available water in spring before that water runs out. So growing plants as fast as they possibly can when we've got water available, and growing lambs, for example, as fast as we can until the water runs out of the farm system. And that requires legumes, particularly deep-rooting legumes. So my focus has been on developing a lucerne-based system. You can't have your whole farm in lucerne, so I've also gone with a legume species that grows fast and early in early spring when I've got soil moisture, and for us that's subterranean clover. You pair that with the drought-tolerant grass species, and pretty much the only drought-tolerant grass species that we have in this country is coxfit, that performs very, very well and is reasonably good quality when you have a legume can grow with it to provide the nitrogen to the cox for it to improve its feed value. The winter forage crop in the conventional system is a simple annual ryegrass monoculture that works well in rotation with the lucerne, and again rotational grazing, but in line with what's used on farms, so a slower movement of animals, a lower stocking density on individual paddocks, and using pesticides, primarily herbicides, as required to control the weed challenge that comes through mainly in the lucerne stand. And those two systems are repeated at 2 levels of plant available phosphorus, Olsen P levels of around about 20 to 25. I'm calling that the high level, and the low, trying to get these quality soils down to about an Olsen P of 10. So we've got in that 10 hectare space 4 2-hectare farmlets, and then we've got lanes in there as well. And each of those 2-hectare farmlets are divided into 20 paddocks. So I've got 80 little paddocks or plots. It's small scale farming, clay farming in the sandpit, so to speak. And we've got these 80 paddocks to work with. Here's just some examples of the pasture and forage types that we're working with. Here's a regen multi-species pasture mix of our 12 species. I'll quantify the yield and the botanical composition of those pastures shortly. So on each of the 2 regen farms, 2-hectare farms, I've got 18 to 20 paddocks into those. I take 2 paddocks each year out of those permanent pastures and grow my winter forage crop to help supplement to the winter feed supply. Those pastures for this winter, those crops for this winter were planted middle of last month, and they've come out of the ground. It's a great season to grow plants. You need water to grow plants well, and we've got that certainly this year. So we're not at canopy closure at this stage, but I'm very, very pleased with the establishment of that pasture, that crop so far. 2 paddocks per farm go into that each year and back into the multi-species permanent pasture. That's what the crops looked like last year. So we've got brassicas knocking about in that mix. There's 3 brassica species. There's Phacelia, there's annual ryegrass, there's a few other bits and pieces in there too, to give me an 8 species mix. And in the conventional system, where we've got our coxsfoot subclover pastures, they're quite good to lamb down on there's 8 paddocks on each of the 2 conventional farms in there. But it's lucerne dominant, so 10 to 12 paddocks are in my lucerne. So I'm pushing the boundary of proportions of the total farm in lucerne. If you read back in the old literature from Lincoln College back in the last century, where they did a lot of work at Ashley Dean with maximising or working out the big proportion of land you can have in lucerne. They were talking about systems in excess of 50% of the total farm area. That puts a challenge on the winter feed supply, but really maximising the total legume production in that system. And then 2 of those lucerne paddocks come out each year and going into a winter tetraploid annual ryegrass crop to help supplement that winter feed supply. On all of the farms, I take hay as a genuine feed surplus and conserve that in a nearby hay shed. So here's my hay storage for this coming winter, and that'll be fed out onto pastures when it is dry and in the winter time. So unlike this year, which is a green year, the normal year looks something like this around February, March, April. So this was autumn 2024. I was supplementary feeding those ewes through that type period on hay, and that was actually my tupping feed, my mating feed. So the feed supplementation was quite important, but I feed most of the hay out in the winter when I'm rationing the total feed supply on the farm. The animals are grazing those winter crops, but also they're on a slow rotation on all of the pastures as well. Our main ecosystem service is animal production. So this is animal production science. This is not dead and busted as yet. We should still be investing in animal production science research and development. And I put a lot of my postgraduate students onto this project. They take ownership on the management of the livestock in the pastures, doing regular weighing and monitoring of the animals. In terms of stocking rate, this diagram illustrates or quantifies the stocking rate of the high fertility conventional farm, and you can see it as a timeline. Back at the December 2021, I started the experiment with some new pastures planted the first block of pastures in then, and then put some old ewes and grazed them out before I got my mating flock. And then after that, I ran some Coopworth hoggets and raised them from lambs from Ashley Dean. They maintained the pastures until I got my breeding ewe flock, which started in August 2023. The breeding flock is a Boheapy breed. It's not a short wool or it's kind of a self-shedding multi breed in there, but it's not a fully shedding animal. It sheds a lot of its belly wool and around the breech and clear on the neck as well. I keep the tails on, so they're quite an easy care management sort of livestock. And I'm running about 14.5 ewes to the hectare, including replacement ewe lambs in the system as well. Lambs are born in spring, so we've got 3 lamb crops so far. Currently the rams are out, so I use maternal and terminal size. Currently the terminal size are out, the blackface rams are out, and I've sold most of the lambs on all of the farms and retaining some replacement ewe lambs from the system as well. At this stage, there is no effect of system on stocking rates. So as a point of illustration, I'm picking out one of the other 3 farms. Here's a low fertility conventional farm. So far, we're not seeing a fertilizer response. And on all the other farms, we're running 14.5 ewes to the hectare, including replacement ewe lambs. On this particular farm, all those lambs were sold a bit earlier than the regen farm, and gone to market, gone to slaughter. The main response measure is livestock production. Here we've got live weight gain, and if I can draw your attention to this current year, which is not complete yet, we're seeing a production cost for the regen system, which has less legume in the system, so we're getting about 70, maybe about 100 kilos per hectare or less live weight gain in the system. That's coming mainly from a reduction in lamb live weight gain, primarily a prime lamb cohort on that lamb crop. And this year, which has been greener, I've been able to keep all of those lambs and sell them as prime. Those trade lambs are sold as prime. In previous summers and autumns, where it get considerably drier, I had to release a lot of those lambs as store lambs to grow them on further off the experiment, and that's what farmers do in dry years. And we see a production response to the treatments for our replacement ewe lambs as well. And if we look at the carcass production, I guess that would be the main result. We're getting close to, or in excess of 300 kilos of per hectare of carcass production from our conventional system. It's about 75 kilos per hectare less carcass production from the 2 regen farms in this wetter year compared to the 2 prior dry years where I had the breeding ewe flocks into the system. We share the ewes in December each year, and the replacement lambs in the following March of each year. The ewes on the conventional farms are slightly heavier, and they're yielding slightly more fleece, and we're seeing a reduction too in the annual wool crop from the regen system as well, compared to our legume-based dominant conventional system. We share the ewes in December. That was my total wool clip for last year. The big 2 bales that I put a sweat on to press those. Bring me back to my days. My father was a shearer, and I spent a lot of my time over summer playing around in wool sheds, so it was good to get back into the wool shed. Anyhow, well, let's look at the pasture production at the plant level. Do we have an effect on dry matter yield? We're not seeing too much of that at this stage. We've got full 5-year data set for the developing farm systems. Let's look at this year. That's still not finished yet. We're seeing a slightly greater yield increase from our conventional farm, but that's not consistent across the years to date. What is important to know when we're talking about diverse pastures in a regen context, or multi-species pastures even in a conventional context, is that the species proportions change considerably from the time of planting. Okay, and that's all to do with the ability of one plant species to get out of the ground from seed. It's quicker than the other and compete for the primary resource, which is light. So the plant needs to develop its leaf canopy to get its sphere of light interception to produce carbon from photosynthesis, etc. But that also applies to every time after you graze that pasture. So the plant that is able to regenerate its leaf canopy after each and every defoliation, grazing or cutting for hay, etc., will win in the competition for the primary limiting resource, which is light and deception. So far, we're seeing these multi-colours across the multi-species farm. And who's winning? Well, we're seeing a dominance of cockspit over time, tall fescues hanging in there. Here's my lucerne, I think, but the legume component is actually a minor component, and we're ending up with primarily grass-dominant pastures. The light yellow is the dead material, so you can see where that dry year is. The plant response to water limitation is reduce leaf area, hunker down until you get your autumn rain. So we see an increase in dead material at those times of the year. In the conventional system, let's take the high fertility conventional farm. Legume dominant system, we've got cockspit being one of our major grasses, our annual ryegrass, growing and utilising that when we need it. But we've got lucerne here providing the dominant feed supply. We've got in the grey, don't know why I'm doing my finger there, I'll use this, and we've got the grey and that bright blue there as our subclover coming through in the spring, primarily when moisture is available. In terms of resource use efficiency, this is where the fun and the data sets come when you try to do the numbers of trying to work out how much light, water and nitrogen these systems are producing. Let's quantify radiation use efficiency, or more precisely, the photosynthetically active radiation. So the wavelength bands that plants actually use for photosynthesis. And we're always in the business of making the most use of free resources in all farm systems, that is light. But despite the big contrasts in the diversity of the farm systems, all four of those farms are capturing about the same amount of light. So they're all managed quite well in terms of minimizing the amount of bare ground and maximizing the amount of light and deception. It's just doing it differently. And when you dive deeper to explain that similarity in light and deception, you go to the pasture canopy level. So the amount of green stuff in a pasture or on the whole farm compared to the amount of bare ground or dead material that's not capturing or not photosynthesizing as well. So what you're seeing here is a ground cover visualization of two of the four farms. I've just pulled out because they fit on a slide nice efficiently. A regen farm and a conventional farm, and you see some green going and shading to yellow, and then these lines. So we've got 20 paddocks on each farm. So this is the ground cover since the start of 2023 until just a couple of weeks ago, last week, of all of those paddocks. So instead of doing a weekly farm walk with a rising plate meter, I use a technique that measures normalized difference vegetation index, basically the greenness of the pastures and the crops. Okay, so every week I do that, and you can see the dry year of autumn 2024 coming through there, where we've got plants downsizing, reducing their leaf canopy. You can see these lines, which basically shows the grazing rotation. So in the winter, our rotation is longer to ration feed, and after each grazing, we remove the leaf canopy. That's how we get that energy from the plant into the animal. The plants after that, each and every grazing, are energy deficient. They rely on stored carbohydrate reserves in the basal parts of the plant to regenerate their leaf canopy until the point that they can photosynthesize more and reach canopy closure. So you can get a visualization of each and every grazing rotation just by looking at the greenness of the pastures. I took 2 paddocks out to plant my winter crop. And these are the previous winter crops coming out of old pasture into winter crop, graze those winter crops once or twice, and then back into new pasture again. So it's quite a good quantification of the green cover, and therefore the ability of a system to capture light, which is our main energy resource for all farm systems. Moving on, Dr. Black. Water efficiency. So we're all in the business of making the most of the water when we have it available. So we can quantify evapotranspiration, or water use efficiency in millimeters. People talk about mils of rain or mils of irrigation. They're wrong. They should be talking about millimeters. So 1 millimeter is 1 millimeter high across 1 square meter of land area. So these crops, these farm systems, this year so far, have used slightly more than 600 millimeters of rain through evapotranspiration. That's what's required to grow. And then you do some fun math, basic arithmetic to work out, well, how much litres of water is required to produce a kilo of lamb carcass? And we've got the ability to do that in this experiment. 39,000 litres of water is required to produce every kilo of lamb from this system, based on my calculations that I ran just last night. That's new numbers for me, so I can't sort of benchmark that. But the second calculation in terms of dry matter takes about 700 millimeters of water for all of those farm systems to produce a kilo of dry matter. Well, that resonates a bit more to me. I know that the water use efficiency of a ryegrass pasture is about 10 kilos of dry matter per hectare for every millimetre. So that basically means it needs 1,000 litres of water, ryegrass, to produce a kilo of dry matter. You add a legume into it, you add more nitrogen into the system, you require less water to produce every kilo of dry matter. Lucerne, by the way, a legume dominant system, will need about 300 to 500 litres of water to produce a kilo of dry matter. It's got a water use efficiency of about 20 to 30 kilos of dry matter per hectare for every millimetre of water used or evapotranspiration. So some exciting numbers in terms of the efficiency of natural resources in the system. The water deficit we quantify on each farm, on each paddock of each farm, down to 0.5 metre, so capturing most of the available water. It's quite an effort to quantify water extraction deeper than that, but we do that for some paddocks, or so that's shortly. So the soil water deficit, tracking along, we've got a wetter season we're experiencing so far this year. Previous years it got particularly dry. There's our dry autumn of 2024, where I released a lot of my lambs early as stores, and again in 2025 I thought I was going to experience another dry year, but it rained, and I released a lot of my lambs as store lambs, but I shouldn't have, because I should have hunkered down and held tight. This year I've kept all of my lambs and didn't freak out when it started to get dry in late spring, because we got more rains, and thankfully I could take most or all of those lambs to slaughter. Once we exceed about 60 millimeters of soil water deficit, we see those plants, those pastures, starting to slow down, but not browning off, slow down in their growth rate. We do measure water extraction to depth, and as I said earlier, we're of the view that a legume species that can extract water deep will be good for deep soils. A plant species that has a shallow rooting depth but starts growing much earlier in spring, so very spring active, such as subclover, is beneficial on those shallower soils. What you're seeing now is a graph of the deep water extraction of some of the plots in the experiment. So I've got an ability to measure water extraction or soil moisture every 10 centimetre layer down to about 2.4, 2.3 metres deep for some plots. The dashed dark line represents the total water holding capacity of this particular soil profile, which is a deep Wakanui silt loam, good cropping soil. And the grey dashed line represents the minimum amount of water that the plants can take out. Okay, it's just held too tight to the soil particles. So we're seeing those 4 farm systems currently, or since December 20th January, operating somewhere within there. And plants too, it's important to note, plants suck the top water out first. It's the easier water to suck. Apparently soils hold water by about 10 atmospheres. You put about 2 atmospheres in your car tyres. So the plants, through transpiration, have to suck quite hard to get the deeper water. Okay, so they work on the easier top water first, and then as the summer dries out into the autumn, they start to access water deeper into the soil profile. I'm not seeing great evidence to say, well, I'm seeing evidence that shows that all of the pastures in the farm systems are extracting water down beyond 1 metre deep when they need to, and in some cases up to about 1.5 metres deep. Nitrogen yield too, it's another important ecosystem service for our farm systems that rely on legumes to provide all of the N from a free resource through nitrogen fixation. Just in the last, we don't have data from our lab, from our analytical lab back for this year, but let's look at the season prior. Our legume dominant conventional systems are yielding more nitrogen than our grass dominant region practices as well. And then you try to do some inefficiencies in there as well. Perhaps less appropriate when you're trying to divide amount of N yield by carcass production. And if you divide it by the dry matter yield, well, they're actually representative, those 29 and 36 values there are representative of the mean N or nitrogen contents of our herbage dry matter. So we tend to see a higher nitrogen content and therefore higher crude protein content from our legume dominant systems. If we step back from all of this and try to make some ideas around the results so far from the regen experiment, we see what is shaping up to be a animal production cost to our regen system. So sometimes diversity or hyperdiversity is not always best if that means what you're offering to the livestock is a lower quality in terms of crude protein availability and higher fibre. We're in the business of producing protein in terms of meat, so we need a protein-based diet. So we can still have a diverse pasture system, but increase our legume base in there too. At this stage, we're not seeing a fertilizer response or soil fertility response, which brings into question, well, should we be putting on these levels of superphosphate to maintain an awesome P of 20 for our dryland systems? There's conversation around that in the industry so far. But stepping back into a broader context, when we're trying to build resilient pasture systems, we're in the business of trying to make the most of the free natural resources when water is available. So light capture is key. That drives the energy for the whole system, and nitrogen fixation allows us to regenerate the leaf canopies to capture that light and convert it into dry matter and into animal product as efficiently as we can. For dryland farm systems, we use the dryland legume species, the plant species. Lucerne fits where you've got deep soils quite well, and we've got management systems to ensure that lucerne thrives. And on the shallower soils, well, what are your legume options too? So we go back to the subterranean clover, which we can manage in such a way that we can manage the pastures for that subclover to germinate in each and every autumn when we get our autumn rains, and grow well in the cool season, particularly in late winter, early spring, to have a high legume content pasture like the one that I showed you at Lambing before the water runs out. Then you can go to the beach in the summer. We can thank many in this overall project. We've got a few more years to go. We're in the Dryland Pastures research team, which is based down at the Field Research Centre. You can hit that scan QR thingy at the top to see our website. Thank you so much. I hope that shapes part of the conversation for the rest of the day in terms of a resilient, diverse pastoral systems. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Al. There'll be opportunities for questions at the end of this session. Somehow I knew you'd use your full time and a little bit more, so we're now back on time. We'll move to our second speaker. If I can invite Dr. Rick Stoffels to come up. We're moving from dryland and pasture systems and in-field production to water. Rick specialises in freshwater ecosystem management, ecological modelling and adaptive monitoring. He'll explain why nutrients are a challenge for our waterways. I think we're all aware of that challenge, what progress we've made and what challenges still lie ahead. So if we can welcome Rick.
Kia ora koutou. Can you hear me? I don't have a microphone on. Is that okay? Yep, some thumbs up there. Cool. So I'm not an agricultural scientist. I've gone through most of my career feeling like an imposter, and I guess that's not any different today. So this is going to be a big shifting gears, I guess. I want to talk to you today about some work we've been doing in Earth Sciences New Zealand within the Healthy Freshwater flagship, which is what I lead. I'm the chief scientist of that flagship. Over the last, I guess, 5 years in particular. A few things I want to talk to you about. I want to talk to you about the problem of multiple agricultural stressors and the impact that's having on freshwater ecosystem health. In New Zealand, we've got a strong track record of looking at the impact of each individual stressor. So by stressor, I mean things like, for example, deposited fine sediment or suspended fine sediment or dissolved reactive phosphorus. They're individual stressors. So we've got a good track record at looking at the impact of individual stressors on freshwater ecosystem health. But more recently, we're starting to look at the synergistic and interactive effects of all those stressors, how they come together to impact freshwater ecosystem health. So I'll talk a little bit about that. I don't want to bring the mood down too much, so that that's only going to be the first part of the talk. And then I'm going to focus on the good news side of things, which is what we can actually do about it. And in particular, I want to focus on a couple of nature-based solutions. My understanding is that this group and this forum today is about sustainable agriculture more generally, and all sorts of solutions that we can implement to move towards really sustainable and productive, I guess, farmscapes and landscapes. But I'm going to be talking about just a couple edge of field mitigations that can help us mitigate agricultural contaminants and their impact on freshwater ecosystems. And then very briefly, I want to talk about how agribusiness, catchment groups and farmers can help. It's kind of obvious in some respects, but I'll be talking about how you can help with actually the science, doing the science around moving towards sustainable farms to look after freshwater ecosystem health. So multiple agricultural stressors, no surprise. Fine sediment runoff from agricultural landscapes into rivers is one of the key stressors we're talking about in suspended and deposited forms. Dissolved nutrients and alteration of flow, so extraction of water from freshwater ecosystems for irrigation. And no great surprise there. We're talking about some of the research we've been doing to understand how these things come together to impact, in particular, freshwater biodiversity. I think one of the easiest ways to understand multi-stressor impacts on freshwater biodiversity ecosystems is in the context of limit setting, which some of you will be familiar with. So here, for example, we've got this is just hypothetical, by the way. I'll show you some real graphs soon. But this is just an individual stressor. It might be a concentration of a nutrient, for example. And this is on the y-axis, we have the percentage of species in an ecological community that might be locally extirpated, so driven locally extinct as a consequence of this stressor increasing. Now, this is what we typically do, look at each individual stressor and the impact it has on biodiversity extirpation. Now, if your target is 20%, say you don't want to exceed 20% extirpation in a particular freshwater ecosystem or even nationally, you might want to set your limit for stressor A here. So like we don't want to go beyond that because we don't want to see more extirpation as a consequence of increasing stressor concentrations in the system. Problem with multi-stressor impacts is that you can get these sort of additive or interactive and synergistic effects where when you combine the two, the impact of A and B can be greater than just A alone. So if you have just that concentration for stressor A as your limit, when stressor A are acting in concert, you end up with a higher level of extirpation species, and that's not the result we want to see. And we should have had our limit back down here in a multi-stressor environment in order to protect freshwater biodiversity. So, onto real data. Lately, we have been pulling together national data sets, so tens and thousands of samples across numerous years. So look at how multiple stressors are impacting macroinvertebrate communities. We've been looking at other communities as well and looking at the impacts on fish as a consequence as well, but focusing at first on macroinvertebrate communities. Starting with just one graph here, you've got dissolved reactive phosphorus here on the x-axis and proportion of the macroinvertebrate community extirpated on the y-axis here. And we have a few different coloured lines. So you can see that generally speaking, one thing to take from this is that as dissolved reactive phosphorus increases, we can see that the level of extirpation we can get in the macroinvertebrate community can be really high, so quite strong impacts. This VC here is for visual clarity of 3 meters, so that's quite good visual clarity. That's when visual clarity is good. there's not too much fine sediment in the water column. We have different coloured lines here for increasing levels of dissolved organic nitrogen. So if you add dissolved organic nitrogen to the mix, you can see that on top of the impact of DRP, you get even more species extirpation. This dashed line here is an old, now dated, I think, national bottom line in an early version of the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management, going back to 2017. And that's for dissolved reactive phosphorus. It was set to maintain quite a low level of, I guess, species extirpation and a high level of ecosystem health, but it doesn't take into consideration the additional effect of adding dissolved organic nitrogen to the mix as well. So even down there at that national bottom line, you can still see that we can expect on the average for relatively high levels of dissolved organic nitrogen, DRP to have a pretty strong negative impact on the macroinvertebrate communities in rivers throughout the nation. Now, when you start to decrease visual clarity, that's decreasing down through here, that means there's increasing concentrations of fine sediment in the water column. You can see that all these curves start to elevate. So the level of species extirpation starts to increase. So we're seeing now with some of the work we're doing that multi-stressor impacts can have a really, really strong negative impact on freshwater biodiversity. These guys here, the macroinvertebrate community in freshwater systems, play a really key role in ecosystem functioning. So, you know, transferring energy up to fishes, processing nutrients, processing organic matter. They're really key players in ecosystem processes and in maintaining ecosystem health throughout the nation. I'm really glad there's a really big screen. This is a pretty horrible plot to put up on for a presentation. All I want to say here is that the story doesn't change no matter which combination of stressors, no matter how you look at these stressors. The story is generally the same. If you look down here, for example, this is where we have visual clarity decreasing down here. As visual clarity decreases as a consequence of increasing levels of fine sediment in the water column, you can see just how sharply species extirpation increases. You add increasing nutrients to that, it really elevates that extinction curve quite considerably. So this is some work we've done looking at how nutrients and sediment interact to affect freshwater biodiversity. We're now bringing hydrological, I guess, stress to the equation as well, incorporating an understanding of how low flows in particular interacting with these contaminants to affect ecosystem processes and ecosystem biodiversity, and getting a better understanding of that too. So just giving you a heads up that we're bringing alteration of flows into the equation now as well. So what does this all mean? This won't be a surprise to anyone, I guess, in the room. The strength or the awareness of evidence for unsustainable practice is really increasing, and it's going to keep increasing over the next 10 years. That, of course, lowers socio-political license to operate as long as this is going to be unsustainable. This is no surprise. I've been in so many meetings with key players in agribusiness over the last year, where the starting point for all those meetings is this. We know that we want to increase the sustainability of our practices, transform our practices, so that we don't have these sorts of problems with freshwater and estuarine ecosystem health. So, what can we do about it? All sorts of things. I want to talk about two things today. A fair bit of research taking place in the Healthy Freshwater flagship on nature-based solutions, two of which are constructed wetlands and riparian buffers. They'll need no introduction, I guess, to the audience. You'll know what they are. These are nature-based solutions where you're looking at these particular systems retaining and transforming contaminants coming off pasture or crops, such that the water coming out at the end of these systems is cleaner. So riparian buffers, I'm not an expert in this, by the way. My field of expertise, there are other people in the flagship that do focus on this sort of work. Chris Tanner, you might have come across Chris Tanner, Fleur Matheson. They're key players behind a lot of this work. So riparian buffers, when it comes to flow paths intercepted surface runoff, they're doing a good job at intercepting contaminants in surface runoff, as well as intercepting contaminants in subsurface flow. By contaminants, I mean nutrients in particular and fine sediment. Not so good at intercepting contaminants in artificial drainage or deep groundwater. Example here of a well-established riparian buffer, and this is also guidance that some of my colleagues have produced back in the days when we were called NIWA, so long ago. Now Earth Sciences New Zealand, so it's a pretty well-established field of research to the point that there is really good pragmatic guidance out there that community groups and farmers can use to install riparian buffers on their farms. Constructed wetlands. These are systems that are installed at key drainage points in farm, in the landscape, places where contaminants are concentrated, and these wetlands are constructed to retain contaminants and convert contaminants, again, such that the water leaving the wetland is relatively contaminant free. Flow paths intercepted, like riparian buffers, they complement riparian buffers. They do intercept well surface runoff as well as subsurface flow, like riparian buffers, but they're also really good at mitigating contaminants in artificial drainage. Again, not so good at intercepting and mitigating contaminants in deep groundwater. As is the case with riparian buffers, we've produced guidance on this in conjunction with Dairy and Z, and that's readily available online. So, agribusiness, I know, like Dairy and Z, for example, beef and lamb, but also farmers more broadly and community groups, they are embracing these nature-based solutions. They are getting implemented. Numerous examples of constructed wetlands getting put in across farms throughout the North Island and the South Island. Ditto for riparian buffers. But you know, what's the evidence that they're doing what they're meant to do? So here's a very, very basic graph produced by Chris Tanner, one of my colleagues, looking at the relative efficiency of mitigating contaminants. So I've got dissolved phosphorus, sediment, microbes, nitrate, and particulate phosphorus here. So this is the relative efficiency across all of these different types of what they call edge of field mitigations. I've put in red boxes the two I wanted to focus on today. So you can constructed wetlands here, various types of riparian buffer up here. There's others that I haven't spoken about today: sediment traps, wood chip bioreactors, algal nutrient scrubbers, entertainment bunds. But you can see that the relative efficiency when it comes to contaminant mitigation of riparian buffers and constructed wetlands is pretty high. It's looking good. Surprisingly effective. Now that's just relative efficiency. You might be thinking, well, what's the absolute retention rate of contaminants with these different types of edge of field mitigations, in particular riparian buffers and constructed wetlands? And it can be, it's quite variable. So if you look at the literature as a whole internationally, not just in New Zealand, it's anywhere between 0 and 90%. And the reason it's so variable is because it depends on context. So, you know, where these nature-based solutions are actually implemented, and also the design of the nature-based solution. So the design of the riparian buffer or the design of the constructed wetland. Design really makes a big difference. I've got an example here of just one particular aspect of design, which is the width of the riparian buffer zone that's installed on around the rivers. And also, so this is retention, so percent of input load of fine sediment or total phosphorus or dissolved phosphorus that is retained within the riparian buffer as a function of buffer width and different types of soil, so sandy loam, clay for each of those three different stressors. And you can see that buffer width has a big influence. This is the results of an international synthesis of riparian buffers. You see that buffer width does have a really big influence on the retention of these contaminants within the riparian zone, and so does soil type, which is the different lines here. So like I say, design makes a big difference. You can get retention rates for all of these contaminants really, really high, as high as 90%, depending on the soil type. Even irrespective of the soil type here, if the buffer width is sufficient, you're getting efficiencies anywhere between sort of 50% up to 90%. That's really, really good news. I was actually really surprised when my colleagues were telling me about the effectiveness of riparian buffers. The same story applies to constructed wetlands. They can be remarkably effective. I'm still surprised by some of the numbers I see. Surprisingly effective. So that's really, really good news. Like I said, design has a really big influence. We don't want to be down here towards the 0% efficiency for our mitigation effectiveness for constructed wetlands and riparian buffers. All the more reason to get your design right and consult the right people to ensure that we're doing things properly. So the other reason I wanted to focus on constructed wetlands and riparian buffers are what my colleagues are calling ancillary benefits. So here on the left, like I say, we have our contaminant attenuation, relative efficiency, but here on the right, we have ancillary benefits arising from different types of edge of field mitigation, different types of nature-based solutions. Habitat biodiversity benefits, aesthetic benefits. They looked at multicultural benefits as well. They're working with various iwi and Rudlanger, and economic return too. You can see that for riparian buffers and for constructed wetlands, the ancillary benefits, and particularly with respect to habitat biodiversity, aesthetics and multi-values are really, really high, unsurprisingly. And I think that's, well, I hope that's also really good news. You can probably tell from my accent, I'm not a Kiwi. I grew up in rural northeast Victoria in Australia. I've got a lot of, I don't come from a rural farming background myself, but I've got a lot of friends that are farmers in northeast Victoria. And I was thinking last night, I thought, do I know a single one of them that doesn't care about biodiversity and habitat value on their property? And I couldn't think of any. Most farmers I know, all farmers I know, care about this sort of thing, right? They love the land, so they want to see productive landscapes, but they also like to see native biodiversity looked after on their land too. So I think this is really good news as well. We're getting the joint benefits of contaminant attenuation on your property with these nature-based solutions, but these ancillary benefits too, which are really key. So, does this mean that all catchments require transformation? The answer is no. Apologies again for this really big wrap in a PowerPoint presentation. I was just lazy. I was just transferring stuff over from manuscripts yesterday to put into this talk. This is data coming from some work we're doing for regional councils, where we're trying to help them, I guess, make evidence-based decisions around what they prioritise in terms of contaminant mitigation and contaminant management strategies, how they prioritise those different strategies across their different freshwater management units. This is an example from Horizons. We have our different freshwater management units as rows here. And what we've got is we've got different stressors down here. So suspended fine sediment, deposited fine sediment. There's your two nutrient types, reduction in temperature as a result of riparian shading, and then reducing the number of low flow days you might have during the summer-autumn period. So these are different types of stressors that we could run some scenarios on. And what we've got is we've got 12.5% improvement on these, 25% improvement, and 50% improvement for each of your, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 freshwater management units in Horizons region. And this is change in macroinvertebrate species richness as a consequence of running these different scenarios. And what will I tell you about this? You can see that for some freshwater management units, there's not much of a response, and that's because they're in pretty good shape anyway in the first place, so no real intervention required. Others are responding quite well. Here, for example, you can see, so some freshwater management units, of course, do require attention. Of course, locals, community groups, farmers would probably know that already. This is just another line of evidence that the regional council really would like to have at their disposal. The other thing to take away is it's not just that all freshwater management units are going to respond equally to interventions, but different types of stressors are going to be particularly important. For some freshwater management units in Horizons, for example, we're seeing not as much of a biodiversity response to improvements in nutrients for some of those freshwater management units, but deposited fine sediment, for example, is having a big impact on the freshwater ecosystem health, and is worthwhile targeting, trying to reduce the amount of deposited fine sediment going into rivers in particular. So it's just helping us getting a better understanding of what to prioritise, so where we need to prioritise action, and what we need to actually do in order to improve freshwater ecosystem health. Apologies for this cheesy. I got Copilot to produce that for me yesterday very quickly. So impacts on freshwater ecosystems, some of that's home revision, I guess, we know that, but I just wanted to emphasise that we're making a lot more progress in understanding how multiple stressors come together to have quite big impacts on freshwater ecosystems health. That's all very recent data. Good news is, you know, we can do something about it. Third thing I wanted to mention is that we're really keen to see farmers, community groups, agribusiness get more involved in what a lot of folks call citizen science, right? So the evidence for the effectiveness of nature-based solutions is really strong when at the fine scale. So where we've actually put in a constructed wetland, for example, or a particular riparian buffer, and we've done some monitoring around those particular areas to look at locally, at very local scales, what the effectiveness of those nature-based solutions actually is. But there's a lot of uncertainty around how the effects of individual nature-based solutions are going to scale up to mitigate contaminants and look after freshwater and estuarine ecosystem health at scale, so at watershed scales. We need to get a better understanding of how these things scale up. As these nature-based solutions are implemented and installed on farms and throughout rural communities, it would be great if we could get more data from those communities to look at the effectiveness of what farmers are installing on their farms. So, you know, this broader community can play a key role in the monitoring, acquisition of that data, so we can get a better understanding of what these nature-based solutions are doing at scale. Earth Science New Zealand can help if there is an appetite, and I know there is on behalf of some agribusiness companies like Dairy, NZ and Beef and Lamb, but more broadly, if there is an appetite to get farmers involved in citizen science and get communities monitoring the freshwater ecosystem response to these nature-based solutions, then Earth Science New Zealand can help you know, design those monitoring programs and help manage data, help analyse data for community groups, that sort of thing. So we're here to help. I think that's got us back on time. No?
Slightly over.
Oh, we're over. Oh, sorry. Anyway, thanks for your attention and thanks for having me. And yeah, happy to take questions later on.
Yep. Thank you very much. So thank you very much, Rick. We'll move on to our next speaker. We're now moving into the practitioner phase. So we've got Matt Ironmonger, a Canterbury farmer who works with obviously farming productivity, but also environmental stewardship. And nicely, we'll talk about wetlands and shelter belts and what that means for him. So please welcome Matt.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks very much for the opportunity, Katie, to be here. And just before I kick off, just a couple of quick comments. Because I probably won't get to comment later, but I was really interested in Alice's presentation around regen and conventional, and I've had the opportunity over a period of time to visit other parts of the world, and certainly agriculture. And one of the things, or the observations I've made, is that New Zealand conventional pastoral farming tends to be representative of what others globally would describe as regenerative. Multi-species, minimum or no tillage, and rotational grazing, that type of thing. So it's interesting how we define things sometimes differently than what others do. And then Rick's presentation was particularly interesting because it relates, I guess, to a lot of the things that we do practically on farm. But one comment really resonated with me was, you know, that we talked about biodiversity and about farmers loving that stuff. And I think whenever you go and visit people's farms, generally they don't take you to look at the wool shed or the dairy shed or the tractor or anything like that. They take you to look at something that's particularly special to them, which is generally a lake or a river or a view or a wonderful patch of bush. And so I think as a community, we're largely on the right track. And I think, you know, as a farmer, I'm very grateful for the support that the science community provides us to help us understand where we can get some, from a scientific perspective, we get more value. That was really good. So anyway, this is not my natural environment here presenting. I'm a farmer, so I thought I'd start with a question rather than a presentation. So my question to you guys is, who do you think is the biggest contributor to environmental enhancement in New Zealand? So, Ange, do you have any answers? I thought I'd pick you out there. So does anybody have any views as to what they think is the biggest contributor to environmental enhancement? Yeah, well, farmers. Well, actually, my view is it's cows, dairy cows. And that may be a little bit of a contentious type hypothesis, but I think cows are the biggest contributor, particularly dairy cows, to environmental enhancement in recent times. They're often labelled with dirty dairying and having an impact, but cows are the biggest contributor, in my view, to recent enhancement. And the reason being is that milk is the single biggest contributor to the New Zealand economy. We have to pay for stuff. We love planting trees. We love doing all the things that Rick talked about, but that has to be paid for somehow. And the way we pay for that is by selling the product to somebody else. And milk is New Zealand's single biggest income earner, and therefore contributes the most. Fonterra is about to distribute around $4 billion on the sale of its mainland group. And Treasury tells us that that $4 billion that comes washing into the economy in a few days' time travels around the economy 7.2 times. So that's $28 billion worth of cash coming into the economy. And I think a lot of that will then go, of course, a lot of that goes to the tax base through PAYE or GST as it travels around the economy. But farmers specifically will end up using a lot of that for a whole lot of the developments that Rick demonstrated and looked at, and which we'll be doing the same as well. And part of the an analogy that I would give elsewhere in the world to that is Norway, a small country, similar size to ours, low population density, a whole lot of things that, you know, I think we'd all agree that we would describe. Even if you haven't been to Norway, you describe Norway as wealthy, well-governed, clearly a whole lot of natural beauty, and environmentally conscious, and a strong environmental basis. But they have to pay for that somehow, and they pay for it out of oil. And like we have to pay for our environmental enhancements out of milk, they pay for it out of oil. 70% of Norway's exports are oil or gas, and that's what funds their community and their environment. I suspect the 70% on today's $4 a litre for diesel, I think that 70% will be significantly bigger now, and they'll be even wealthier than they are now already. So I think really I just wanted to set the scene as a farmer, we look at these things from a, you know, in a number of ways, obviously what we desirably want to do, but we actually have to fund these, do them somehow. So the other contention that I'd have for you guys is that consumers have no interest in ecosystem services. There is no consumer out there largely that is interested in anything to do with ecosystem services. And I've got a couple of examples for you on that. Again, if we use the dairy industry, Nestle is the biggest customer of New Zealand dairy products, our biggest export. And they're a large global conglomerate, food conglomerate. 70% of their products are bad for human health. So generally when a consumer is eating that product, if they're eating a Kit Kat biscuit, they're not thinking about ecosystem services. They're not even thinking about their own health. Now, I like Kit Kat, so that's fine, but I don't think about my health or ecosystem services. So the consumer is not thinking about that. However, the customer, our customer is Nestle, they are thinking about that. And they're thinking about that not for the ecosystem services, but generally what is driving them is around share price, access to green finance, and it's a business decision. And so we need to make sure that we've got clarity when we're talking about these subjects around what is actually driving the outcomes that we're looking to create. So another example here in New Zealand, we have these perceptions of certain things, and if we look at the beef, this was sorry, I'm not very good at these slides, but this is particularly poor to visually see, but it's a really good example. So the carbon footprint of New Zealand beef, the biggest footprint is organic beef. Has the biggest footprint mainly because it's very unproductive. Now I think fantastic. Organic beef's great. I've got nothing against it. I'm sure it eats perfectly well and is a wonderful product. But from a carbon perspective, it has a very poor and significantly large carbon footprint. About half as much again as New Zealand feedlot beef. So if we're looking to drive down our carbon footprint as farmers, we need to be feedlotting, not going to organics. So these are, this is idealism versus realism, and about making choices in the community and as farmers. So a couple of things to create some contention and create some thoughts. I'll give you a little bit of background about me. I manage an agribusiness, which we are locally here. We've got a couple of dairy farms near Leeston, about 20 minutes away, and some sheep and beef assets and dairy assets out on the peninsula. So a large-scale business over a large area of diverse farm systems, all based around pastoralism, so all grass-based pastoral systems. It's owned by Brent and Belinda Thomas. My wife and I have a small shareholding in it also, and we have a big team of people. I'll give you a little bit of this is a little bit of a video of the business. So that's what I do, manage a whole range of assets. And part of my role, a big part of my role is around capital allocation. So where do we spend our money and what do we do and what do we invest in? So if we look at specifically, Katie asked me to chat about today about shelter belts and wetlands and how we use native plantings within that. And it relates a little bit to some of Rick's presentation. So that's what I'll cover off now about within that business, and with that background of our philosophy around how we pay for things. This is what we do. Well, this is what we've found. These are some of our observations. So shelter belt. So clearly it's not just wind protection. It does a whole lot of things for us. So we grow a lot more grass effectively. So and we measure that through a rising plate meter and a number of other measurements around. We know that we're producing more grass where we have installed shelter protection. A whole lot of other obvious things that most of you will recognise. Clearly shelter protects animals, so you get reduced losses. So they are direct financial drivers to installed shelter belts as protection. Obviously, evapotranspiration, we've got a large, you would have seen the video, large area of irrigation. So we have more than 1,500 hectares irrigated, and that comes at a cost. If we can reduce the amount of irrigation we require by protecting the land and the soil and the pastures, then we can, that's a direct saving. And there at the bottom, cold and heat stress. Clearly, when you drive around farms, you see animals, even on a cool day, sitting in the shade, and obviously in bad weather, that's obviously where they are as well. So that's shelter beds. Then wetlands. So, and this is actually wetlands and riparian planting for us. So it's sort of I've lumped it into the same thing, and it's really critical for us because ultimately there's a whole lot of positive stuff that our science colleagues can tell us it does, but from our perspective, any of these things, EMP, particularly, if we lose those, we have to go out and replace them and buy them. And so there's actually, for us, if we lose something through into the waterways or through the soil profile and it disappears off the farm, that's an asset that we have to go to the shop and buy and replace it to actually remain productive. So really important opportunities. And what we know we've done over about 10 years, we've tested the water coming in one property coming onto the property at the top end and going out the property at the bottom end. And we know we're having a significant improvement because over that time period, we test the water about 3 times a year. And over that period, it ranges between 8 to 12% improvement in water quality of the water as it passes through the farm. So that's even with intensive agriculture, dairy in particular, in that area, that we are significantly improving the water as it passes through by undertaking all of these activities. So it has an environmental outcome, but also has a financial outcome as well. And obviously, clearly for us, we stabilise the water tables, and that's particularly important at the moment where we have significant events. We had a significant event recently in February where we had a heap of flooding, and stabilising those environments has a big impact on the balance of our infrastructure. So we've got a lot of shelter belts that are planted with exotic species, and they work really well, have a lot of benefit. However, I was talking to a gentleman here before about Southland and the damage in the wind last year, where you see these massive trees, 80 and 100-year-old trees knocked over. What our experience is that the shelter that we're creating out of native plantings is protected from some of that, not all of it, but a large proportion of that. So we've found that significant benefit. We've created corridors for flora and fauna, and we are measuring through cacophony testing. I struggle with that word often, but basically what birds are actually living in that environment. And we're particularly seeing we're being mauled by fantails, and they are, they have a particular benefit around reducing our reliance on having to use pesticides to control negative insect species in our pasture system. So it's about creating, for us, it's using these tools, it's about creating a mosaic of productivity and biodiversity, and making sure that we get the strength from both to improve the total sum. And so there's a couple of things that we've, from a practical point of view, that we've observed that are important in either the shelter belts or wetlands. There's going for fast establishing nurse species first, and then the slower canopy species. We actually have a really well articulated program of how you're going to undertake that development. So corridors, riparian zones, and not scattered fragments. There's been a tendency in the past for people to plant a corner or plant something here or there. It's actually creating a whole connectivity to make sure it functions as a piece of infrastructure. And then maintenance, it's not spray and walk away. It's a big cost, between $20,000 to $40,000 a hectare to establish these native biodiverse areas, whether it's wetland or shelter or any of these aspects, riparian planting. So it needs continual maintenance, especially during establishment. So that's spraying, release spraying, and weed suppressant, that type of thing, to allow them to establish. So ultimately, as I said, just like Norway, we have to afford to do these things. We have to sell something. We have to make we have to make it work. So I talked about the productivity gains, reduced evapotranspiration, improved grass growth, better livestock production, input leakage, reduced input leakage, so NP, all of those things, there's improvement there. But also land value. And how do we, there's some emerging at the bottom there, some emerging biodiversity credits, but that's not really relevant just yet for us in commercial farming. But land value, ultimately, land is our biggest asset. Stock has a big value, but the land component swamps everything else. And how do we actually quantify the land value or the impact on land value with native plantings of shelter and riparian planting, that type of thing? So it's classes, and I've just been through this. We go through this every 2 to 3 years with valuers. And over a period of 10 years, I've noticed the increased use of amenity value. So amenity value is a way in which the valuer can attribute value to aspects of the farm that are not necessarily driven out of the production base or the fixed assets. So it's not a house, it's not a shed, it's a whole lot of amenity value. And some of that's view, and you can see there's a view of the Kaiteriri spit, but there's a whole lot of other stuff that that investors in land are looking at now, and particularly around having installed infrastructure of wetlands and shelter where it's connected, not fragmented. So investors in farmland are looking for systems, not sort of scatterings of stuff. They're looking for a systematic approach. And really, ultimately, it comes down to risk reduction, and that's directly related to capital value. So if we can reduce the risk of impact of climate change, impact of legislation, impact of the customer demands, all of those sorts of things, that speaks to capital value. So we can attribute a significant amount of our asset value on our balance sheet to a range of these aspects of that we develop on farm. So a high-performing farm, and I'm not saying we are, but there are a number of high-performing farms, and aspirationally we want to be a high-performing farm, and we need to design this as infrastructure. It's not an add-on. And once it becomes, rather than a nice planting in a corner, once it becomes part of the farm system, it actually becomes a lever to access value. And I think probably the other point here is sometimes we put things in boxes, that something is environmental and has an environmental driver, and otherwise it can be financial. I actually think the same. They're both actually identical. They're the same thing. By protecting the waterway from P&N loss, we're also financially creating an opportunity for saving within the business. So environmental and financial are not mutually exclusive, they're actually inclusive. And people sometimes challenge that and say that farmers generally are doing that to appease the lobby groups, to look good in the eyes and be of the public and be have a social license. But I actually disagree. I think as I've talked about these native plantings, it's very rare that you get something that improves production, reduces the risk, and can also future-proof the business and give you actual value. And I think most successful farms in New Zealand see this type of development as good farming, not just green farming, which they can be accused of it. So I sort of rattled through because I'm worried about time, but these are the thoughts that I'll leave you with, in my view. So these native planted shelter belts and wetlands for us as a business, risk mitigating, but also create value and differentiated value, especially in the marketplace if we're valuing assets or we're creating saleable products, commodities that we're selling. And that amenity is now a clearly recognised component of rural land value. Thanks very much.
Thank you. If I can ask that you just stay behind. If I can ask Rick and Al to come back up, and we'll just take a few minutes for questions while Al is coming down. I'll just make a comment. I have a colleague who is a rural valuer who has written on environmental regulation and environmental policy drivers, and how they actually have not just amenity value but increased the capital value of farms by incorporating environmental features. Does anyone have questions? If I can ask you to state your name and affiliation, please.
Future Farming Centre. Alistair, thank you very much for that. One of the things that's striking me about this trial is after 5 years, how little these systems, particularly the high and low P ones, and I've long also struggled with system level comparisons, scientific effective systems, compare them, and most of the time they're different. You kind of get it great. We've got different systems and they're producing different results. Why?
How do you explain?
Of course we can't. My question is, we don't have the reductions in it. Or a pointed question.
Right, yeah, so why are they delivering similar results? I think we're in a tight funding window, so we've got 7 years to do something that really should reflect a long-term change. And these things, particularly below stuff we're standing on, takes time to do. And then what it also tells me is that currently the inputs, in this case the natural resources, particularly the P availability, nitrogen, are meeting the requirements for all of the systems. They're operated slightly differently, but primarily they're all best practice options with respect of we're managing our pastures well to maximise light capture primarily. And that's the main thing that farmers can manipulate to change the output of the system. And it also tells us that, well, our soil Olsen P levels, which is our New Zealand measure of plant available phosphorus in the soil, are sufficient to meet the requirements of light limiting or light driven pasture and crop reduction in the system, which when we take these data, particularly when we've done phosphorus responses now for lucerne, it tells us that lucerne yield is not changing at all across a broad range of Olsen Pre's. So to bring that to the commercial market, you have a great and awesome conversation with fertilizer companies around that. So we're quite tempted to bring that information to the public sector, but the commercial sector. But the rate trial was also evidence for that too. So I guess we're in early stages. My primary goal was to set up these systems and hopefully after this funding window leverage off the resource that I've created, and hopefully we can maintain that going forward. So value collaboration into a future.
I'll take one more question. Yeah.
Parameters around its
Yeah, good question, and it's timely because, as you know, Earth Sciences New Zealand has just formed as a result of amalgamation of NIWA, Geological and Nuclear Sciences, and soon Met Service New Zealand. So we're just having discussions now with the groundwater scientists who are coming into the Healthy Freshwater flagship, and they have that's their role, that's their expertise. Looking at the impact of farming practices on groundwater health, and then how that groundwater health eventually then goes on to have an impact on surface water health as well as estuarine health at the bottom of the systems. So the simple answer is yes, we are looking at that. I don't have a really good understanding of exactly what they're going to be looking at over the next 5 years, and those discussions are just starting now. But if you want to inform those discussions, then get in touch with me. It'd be great to hear from you.
Okay, we'll leave it there because we are over time. Can I ask that you once again thank our speakers? I believe we've got a small gift, Katie, for each of our speakers. And if we can come back, I'll give you an extra 2 minutes on the time, 10:37, to be back in the room, please. And please do not bring in your refreshments if you leave them out there. So thank our speakers once again. Thank you very much, everyone. You did make it back on the 7th, but 10:47 rather than 10:37. So in our next session, we're talking about innovation and integrated land management tools, technologies and practices for sustainable production. Again, we have 3 speakers for this session. Our first session is Dr. Catriona McLeod from the Bioeconomy Science Institute. As you can see, she's not stood up here with me. She's actually online. I believe a broken ankle has prevented her from getting here. So thank you for being here, and hopefully it will recover quite quickly. Catriona works at the intersection of social and ecological systems and will introduce a new online biodiversity assessment tool designed specifically for New Zealand farms. I haven't actually asked this of Catriona, but is it already available online?
Yes.
Yeah, then I have seen it myself, so I have actually had a look at it, but I'm interested to hear a little bit more about it. So over to Catriona, please.
Thank you. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Catriona McLeod tōku ingoa. Thank you for the opportunity to give this talk, and please just shout out if you can't hear me. I'm softly spoken at the best of times, but doing this online is a bit surreal with you all in the lecture theatre and me at home. I just wanted to start by saying that this piece of work was really trying to illustrate a new process, an approach for designing sustainability assessment tools for New Zealand farms in general. And we chose biodiversity as an example to focus in on developing a proof of concept for the approach, as we felt that that was a sort of an area that was broadly neglected compared to some of the other areas of sustainability management on New Zealand farms. So, oops, sorry, let's see if we can get this next slide. So this piece of work emerged from an MBE funded program called the New Zealand Sustainability Dashboard, and it involved a huge number of different people and some international collaborations with the Cool Farm Alliance, which I'll speak a bit more about shortly, and a group at Cambridge University who've been synthesizing global conservation evidence. It also had a huge amount of stakeholder input from a whole range of different sectors working across New Zealand, as well as other parties involved in managing biodiversity in New Zealand's production systems. So government agencies, NGOs, private consultants, and you can see from the array of logos here, there's a broad representation. And we also drew on expertise from across a range of different universities in New Zealand, as well as the old CRI models, and again, drawing on government agencies and private consultants more working in the environmental arena. So the core challenge that we set out to try and address is this issue of how to measure environmental outcomes of actions. So often if you're trying to measure something that's really hard to measure and you're really uncertain about the outcome, then the chances are that you're wasting your time trying to action that. Whereas, so industry typically will focus on management programs that look at recording what actions farmers are taking on the ground, but we're often uncertain about whether those actions are delivering the desired outcomes that we're looking for from an environmental perspective. As researchers, we often invest a huge amount of effort, as we heard about earlier on in the talks today, measuring the outcomes of a given action, for example, or a different management practice. But that investment in terms of monitoring to measure that outcome, to be certain about it, requires a huge amount of resource that isn't really very practical if you're a farmer on the ground trying to demonstrate that the changes that you're doing are making a difference. So what we're trying to do here in this piece of work was to try and address the sort of sweet spot by looking at what is the evidence that a given set of actions actually delivers the desired outcomes. And this was the rationale behind the Cool Farm tool design, which was introduced to the international community through this international sustainability consortium. And the broad concepts that it was trying to address is one, that we create evidence, but it's not necessarily what land managers on the ground actually want. So there's a sort of disparity between what evidence people are looking for and what we are actually delivering. And then on the other side of it is that people are making decisions, but they're potentially not even looking for evidence, or it might be using information that's out of date, or it's incomplete or potentially biased. So how can we help people overcome some of these challenges? So our partnership with the Cool Farm Alliance was essentially this umbrella organisation that brings together a whole range of different multi-corporate organisations from across the globe to try and develop a set of harmonised indicators for reporting on agricultural sustainability. And I've just selected a few here, which I think are parties, and we've already had mention of a couple of them, I think, in the talks today, around that are really relevant to New Zealand farmers and being able to access markets. So I'm just going to do, my talk's going to focus on these three threads. So trying to think about how do we tell the story, or how do we enable New Zealand farmers to be able to report on their biodiversity management that they're taking in a context that's really relevant to what they're doing on the ground and to New Zealand's biodiversity, rather than having a sort of helicoptered in broad brush approach from outside. And so to do that, we first started by looking at what are stakeholders' priorities, trying to understand that. Then thinking about, well, how can we make better use of the expertise that we have in the country for biodiversity? And then finally, what are some of the pathways that we can enable evidence-based decision-making on the ground? So to start off with, we started out thinking about, well, what are some of the priorities that farmers and other parties managing biodiversity have in terms of being able to tell the story of New Zealand's biodiversity across the production landscapes. So to start off with, we collated a whole load of as broad as possible range of lists of what are the potential biodiversity groups that people might be interested in, what are the kinds of actions that people might be implementing or should be thinking about implementing to inform on biodiversity management in New Zealand's production landscapes. So what we did is we created as comprehensive lists as we possibly could, drawing on existing reports and information from the literature and policy documents, as well as drawing on this sort of global evidence database. And what that gave us was a list of about 20 different biodiversity groups and about 80 potential different biodiversity management actions that people could be taking on the ground. So then we went out and surveyed different perspectives. So the idea here was to ask either individuals or small groups of individuals, for example, working within an individual organisation, what were their perspectives on what they thought were the priorities? So which biodiversity groups do they think were important? Which biodiversity management actions did they think were most likely to deliver or they were considering delivering on the ground? And we did this with quite a detailed survey with a small group of advisors at the top there, and then a broader brush, shorter survey of farmers across a range of different sectors, and again, other parties that weren't farmers but working within farming production landscapes. And what we did was then collate that information so we get a sense of what the different groups of priorities were for those different stakeholder groups, and then brought that information together and put it in front of an advisory panel, which encompassed a whole range of different roles. And the idea here was that we could see some really quick and easy wins that everybody agreed were top priorities, and then others that they clearly weren't were bottom of the list. And then there's a bit in the middle where people needed to have a bit of a debate around what's important and making trade-offs. And so what we did there was kind of work through a systematic decision process to identify what those priorities should be. And from that list, so from the 20 biodiversity groups, we narrowed it down to 10 biodiversity groups. And then from the 80 actions, we narrowed that down to 40 different actions. And the idea here was that we designed something that everybody would benefit from, but it didn't necessarily mean that you couldn't add in others in the future that might be more tailored to your specific need or specific sector's needs. But it meant that everybody gained from the start. So once we got this list of actions and different biodiversity groups that were of interest, then we went about assessing, well, how effective is that action and likely to deliver desired biodiversity outcomes? So again, we used a structured decision-making process, bringing together experts from across the country in a range of different roles and expertise, and asked them to assess for each pair of actions and biodiversity outcomes, asking the question, how beneficial do you think this action is? How harmful do you think this action is for that biodiversity group? And how certain are you about, based on your expertise or the evidence that's in front of you, about those benefits and harms? And so on the right-hand side, essentially what you're doing is you're sampling your population of experts in the same way that you go out in the field and sample on the ground. And then you start to see where there's agreement and where there's disagreement. And so what we were again able to do here is focus the conversation on where there was less agreement between the experts, but and then classify the actions. So the top action here, clearly strong agreement that there's benefits, the middle two, some likely beneficial, and then the last one, it might have been that it was unlikely to be beneficial, unknown, potentially ineffective or harmful. Through that process, we assessed 40 different actions. So each of the boxes on the left hand of the screen here represents an action. And you can see they've been grouped according to where on the farm you might implement them and the kind of focus that they have. So you've got, let me see my mouse here, sorry. So you've got agricultural pests as a focus in here, soil health, and down here, natural forests and large biodiversity refuges on the farm. And on the right-hand side, you've got the different biodiversity groups that were assessed. So the flows between these indicate where benefits are expected to be delivered to those biodiversity groups based on the actions that are taken on the left-hand side. So, for example, natural forest clearly delivers benefits for native birds and native bush plants, but there's also flow-on benefits here for soil life and beneficial insects as well. So the idea here is you've got that all of those different actions assessed and all the potential outcomes for a range of different biodiversity outcomes up front and clear here. So we collated this huge resource of information. How do we make that accessible so that people on the ground can quickly and easily make decisions? So that was the focus of our next piece of work, which was basically collating that information in a way that would allow a farmer to say, well, how nature friendly are the actions that I'm taking on the farm? What might be the action that I'd like to take next? But also touching on some of these other goals, which have been mentioned in discussion the earlier talks today, things about thinking about market access, being able to tell New Zealand's biodiversity story, meeting my industry's reporting requirements, and potentially also submitting like a farm environment plan. So basically what we did was we created this online calculator. So on the left-hand side, you work through a series of questions, and it's either a yes/no answer or a tick box. And on the right-hand side, you have a live score for your biodiversity. So the total possible points that you could acquire for that, in this case, this is the area of the farm at the top, and then the biodiversity groups below. And then this is your score as you work through the questionnaire. So in this case, we're focused on different actions that you might be taking on a farm. So are you growing more than one type of crop? And then the consequences on the right-hand side. Likewise, we've heard already today about have you got a waterway on your farm? Are you providing woody buffers or grassy buffers around those waterways? And then being able to see that you've got the response from your aquatic fauna and wetland birds. So the idea here is to kind of shift the conversation and kind of give people a bit more nuanced information from I'm doing biodiversity friendly actions to what are the biodiversity groups that are benefiting from the actions that I'm taking. And so one of the things that came through when we were doing that prioritization exercises, a lot of the non-farming groups were prioritizing native biodiversity responses, but the farmers were really keen to see what are the responses for beneficial insects and soil life that are directly contributing to production. And so what we hope is by providing this more nuanced insight into what we mean when we say we're taking a biodiversity friendly action, you can kind of support or inform some of that discussion or debate where people might be slightly talking past each other around what it is that they're achieving or potentially not achieving. So at the moment, the tool is just designed that you can download a report, which basically gives the questionnaire, your response to the questionnaire and the scores that you achieved. We deliberately didn't go as far as storing the data because we wanted to have a more nuanced conversation around how data should be stored and how this information might be used within systems that would be useful to farmers on the ground. And finally, just to shift focus slightly, so we've got this tool that was designed for an individual farmer, but how might it inform at an industry level? So I've just generated here a hypothetical industry of 1,000 farms, and what I've got here is the number of different biodiversity refuges on each farm, so ranging from some that have none through to some that have quite a few, and the number of farms within that 1,000 that have those refuges. And then the idea being that the percentage score so this is the percentage of the total possible score for the biodiversity tool, and this is what you would expect as your baseline score based on simply on what refuges you have on your farm, not based on any additional actions. And so what this gives us is a baseline assessment of what your farm looks like based on habitat alone. And then taking for each of those farms, what are the possible actions that I could take on that farm based on the habitats that are available on the farm? And then thinking about, well, if we were an industry and we were encouraging farmers to implement 25% of their possible actions on the farm, we'd see only a very slight increase in biodiversity relative to the baseline. So baseline is 1, so it's sort of between a 1 and a 2 gain. But if you increase and implemented all 100% of your possible actions for your given farm, then on average across the industry, we'd see a 7-fold gain in biodiversity outcomes across the industry. But this assumes that farmers are just picking up and choosing actions at random. But another option would be that we help them to prioritize those actions. And so in this case, you could have half as many actions being implemented on the ground and still achieve a 3-fold gain in your biodiversity outcomes at an industry level. Similarly, you could have a 5-fold gain in biodiversity actions by reducing your actions by a third. So you start to see how it might inform on a policy level process. So what I hope shown you is that there's some opportunities here to use a tool like this to explore trade-offs among different policy options, but also to think about what might be realistic and clear goals that people can work towards, and then also being able to explain to land managers why you're asking for a certain level of management effort. And I'll finish there. I just wanted to let you know that there are a range of different resources available on our website, and you can access the tool and have a play around with it. And thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Catriona will stay online and will be available at the end of this session to answer questions along with our other two speakers. Our next speaker is from the dairy sector, Dr. Justin Kitto from Dairy NZ. He works closely with farmers, catchment groups and policy teams to turn environmental ambition into practical action on farm. So I'll hand over to Justin.
Cool, thank you. Can you hear me down at the back? Am I sweet as? I don't really want to be yelling into a microphone. So yeah, good morning and thank you very much for the opportunity and taking the time out of your busy days to come and hear me talk. And as mentioned, I'm from Dairy NZ, and the framing of my presentation today is farming with water, not against it, and in particular how nutrients, wetlands and biodiversity function with inside productive dairy systems. And for me, the reason for that framing is that this is not an aspiration, this is actually starting to happen on the farm. Yes, it's coming from a low base. Yes, it's coming from a heavily modified landscape, but the wheels are starting to turn. It is happening, and for me, it's how do we enable it? How do we remove that friction to actually speed it up and get it happening at scale? And also working with the landscape and those processes to really get these good things that are happening sped up. So for today, it's going to look like, I'll talk about what it looks like on farm, how these actions actually sit within nutrient management. They're not bolt-ons, they're not something that happens to the side, it's actually a part of nutrient management. Talk about what I've learned from farmers that are actually implementing this and grappling with it and getting frustrated about it. And then the tools and monitoring and the systems that encourage this change of land use or repurposing of land. And then, yeah, just some of the bottlenecks and how we can scale it up to get more of it happening. So this is just a couple of examples I've found of riparian planting that I've been to. I've visited these farmers recently. And this is actually becoming increasingly common on dairy farms throughout the country. Yes, we do work in or farm in heavily modified landscapes, but what strikes me is that people often think it's not happening, but it is. I think the problem is when there's a bunch of ecologists in here that probably think, what this could have looked like if we never drained wetlands or if we never removed riparian planting, what it could look like or what it could look like knowing what we know. And yes, we do have awesome examples like this, but I think what the challenge is, because it's such a new thing coming on board and growing momentum, is that we don't see the mature wetlands, we don't see the mature forests, we see the plant guards and the little trees that are about knee height, and you can't always see them when you're speeding down the road. But farmers are doing this, and it is happening. And it's happening at scale. And the reason why farmers are often doing it is it actually makes farm management easier. It doesn't. Farmers are often pragmatists first, environmentalists second. So it's how can this sort of activity make farm management easier? How do I deal with those boggy paddocks? How do I deal with erosion? How do I deal with stock losses? And then they repurpose that land, that marginal land that they might actually be losing money on, and they're repurposing it and they're giving it back to nature, and it complements the rest of the farm system. So for me, the question's not whether farmers are willing to do this, it's how do we scale it up and how do we remove friction? And there goes some more recent examples of farmers implementing wetlands in amongst their productive landscapes. And as you can see from these photos, they're not taking out entire paddocks, they're not taking out entire blocks of their farm. They're doing it, they're following the margins of the land, they're differentiating between land that is hard to farm and not worth farming, and land that is worth farming and they need to focus on. And for me, this is sort of the logic diagram that they're following. So based on some awesome science that's come out of our CRIs and our universities over the decades, we've got a pretty good first principle grasp of nutrient inputs, about timings of fertiliser, where they feed, effluent, stuff like that. And those things land on paddocks, but then it takes water to move it, whether that's rainfall or irrigation, that then moves it. So it's those pathways that are starting to become important, and identifying those pathways is critical. it's not just paddock boundaries, it's within the paddock boundaries where it's important. And that's where those loss pathways come from. We've got a disproportionate amount of our contaminant load leaving our farms through very minute parts of the farm. And that's where those loss pathways like seeps and swales and critical source areas come into action. And then what farmers are doing is they're targeting those mitigations, they're repurposing that land into very discrete parts of the landscape, where those actions are having disproportionate benefits for slowing flow and trapping sediment and retaining or transforming nutrients, processing contaminants, benefiting the in-stream environment. So for me, this is not just nutrient management. These are not bolt-ons to nutrient management. This is nutrient management. And this logic diagram is starting to embed itself with awesome tools and products, like, for example, the NIWA constructed wetland guidelines and Overseer. These are some of the tools farmers are using, but they're not without their challenges. And what I'm, watching this debate ever since I've left university, what I'm really enjoying is all of these themes and all of these pressures that farmers are under starting to coalesce around farm system optimization. So, like I mentioned, we've got, well, I haven't mentioned it, I mentioned it now, we've got regulations. So wetlands and riparian margins are starting to be used as tools within regulatory processes, within consents, within freshwater farm plans, for dairy conversions to either offset and or maintain their environmental footprint. And the focus is on intercepting the nutrient losses from those known pathways. Again, it's not retiring entire paddocks, it's retiring and repurposing those critical parts of the paddock, which are high loss. Farm systems and farm advisors, because of that regulation element, they're starting to see wetlands and riparian margins and swales as opportunities to contain environmental footprint, reduce environmental footprint, really work with that good performing land to get production out of that, but retiring that marginal land that might not be producing that much as a big environmental footprint and repurposing it to complement the entire farm system. And then now that greenhouse gases are coming online, and that's starting to be spoken about and priced and efficiency introduced, it's improving that nutrient efficiency per unit of product produced. So it's improving the losses and efficiency, and it's supporting the optimization of the entire system. And again, just go back to this photo here, which I quite enjoy. This is from someone I know quite well, and he's just taken over the farm off his father. They've gone through succession, and this part of the farm was always ended up underwater every year, and his father spent hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to drain it, trying to improve the productivity of it over the years, and it was a losing battle. And he's just given up. He's retired it. As you can see, he's already worked on creating a wetland on one part of the farm, and this water on the bottom right hand side, he's currently in the process of creating a wetland complex in there to improve habitat for tuna. So this was an unproductive part of the farm. It was always boggy mess. It was always full of weeds. They were losing money hand over fist trying to drain it. They've repurposed it. But this is another example closer to home in the Amuri Basin. According to the irrigation scheme, this is the lowest point in the entire catchment. It used to be a wetland. It was developed, and while it was developed, it was never fully developed, and it was never as effective as they wanted it to be. It was, again, a boggy mess, and they've repurposed it into a wetland, into a nutrient sink. And another example of, you can't quite see it, but here, over about here, in scale, there was a big seep, and it was coming out of the side of the hill, and it was flowing down this part of the paddock. It was completely wet, completely boggy, completely pugged up, and they've just retired it. And again, they've created tuna ponds in it, so it's repurposing that land. And then another example of a gully that was a bit of a seepage wetland, riparian, steep hillside, and the farmer was complaining about these parts of the paddock were hard to farm, full of weeds. Whenever they went on holiday, they were guaranteed to find 3 or 4 cows stuck in the bottom or dead that they had to rescue before they went on holiday. So they're in the process of repurposing it. And these farmers here, they love sitting down with Fonterra, trying to quantify what the carbon sequestration potential of these assets were and how that would change through time, and it would start generating an income for them, or at the very least, offsetting the cost of going through this planting process. In terms of what I've learned from working with farmers, what I've often seen is, you know, like I said, the pragmatists first, conservationists second, and the environmental outcomes always follow the practical side of the farming. How does this improve animal flow? How does this improve shelter? How does this get rid of a boggy problem? And when they find a practical benefit for it, how it adds value to the rest of the way that they farm, they go for it. They really get stuck into it. Trust matters more than technical perfection. So co-design beats prescription, and farmer knowledge improves outcomes. When farmers live there, they've lived there for generations. They know how these things work. They know the pitfalls. They know what success looks like and what the constraints look like that any consultant ever would. And so when you rely on their knowledge, that's when you get great outcomes. And also, well-suited, simple solutions always trump technical, high-spec solutions. So that's when the whole, the perfection gets in the way of good. Something good is a much better outcome than something perfect. At least something good will get done, whereas something 95% effective might not get done because it's too high-spec. And then within that, poor design and a lack of maintenance limits these projects. I've known farmers who have spent tens of thousands of dollars planting because that was the awesome bit. They all died because they never maintained it. So that's where the maintenance becomes really quickly. And that's what happens. Also, I've seen it with where government funding or regional council funding has come in. The money is always available for the sexy bit, which is photo opportunities of kids and politicians planting plants. The money all of a sudden evaporates when it comes time to doing maintenance. And that's the critical bit, and end up, you just wasted that money if there's no maintenance that comes from it. And then finally, that long-term success happens when farmers own the solution and it's designed in their vision with what they want to achieve. They'll get behind it, they'll own it, they'll look after it. And in terms of tools, this is what we're working with at the moment. So as I mentioned, we've got this awesome guideline here that NIWA has produced, and Derry and Z helped them, but an awesome piece of work that is evidence-based on how effective constructed wetlands are at removing nitrogen from the water and adding to biodiversity. Awesome guideline. The problem is, the challenge that we've got is we then have to take this awesome set of principles that are evidence-based, they're amazing, but we've got to transfer them into a local context, a local farmer's budget, and doesn't always work. So that's where this pragmatism over perfection starts rolling the way. We've got Overseer, which supports whole farm planning, but it's a farm average model. And as I described before, we've got a lot of the losses concentrated in very defined pathways. So how do we marry up tools that are very context, spatially explicit versus tools that are an average tool that look over the whole farm and might not complement each other very well? How do we actually get that working together? And that's one of the things that we're grappling with, okay? And yeah, the other challenge that we're dealing with, or like I said, effective mitigation, spatially targeted, but the monitoring is often across a farm. So those benefits that we're applying at a very discrete part of the landscape, which could be filtering a whole lot of the farm or a high proportion of the farm, is diluted by those farm averaging tools and hidden. And targeted actions, they're often measurable at the point of intervention, but sometimes the consenting process struggles to deal with that. And then another challenge we've got is the whole system design and judgment and evidence. As I've sort of been saying, it all needs to pull together. But how can, and one of the questions I've got is, how does judgment align in a consenting process, which is sometimes adversarial and very distrustful? What role does judgment play in marrying up those targeted tools versus those farm average tools? So for me, and what I've experienced talking to farmers is farmers are not willing to do this. They're already investing in it. They're already doing it. It's already complementing their farm system. but they are up against headwinds, they are up against friction. So the regulation and consenting uncertainty, the cost of it is sapping farmers' interest in doing this. I know farmers that they were doing it. They're spending tens of thousands of dollars a year and they've stopped doing it because they don't actually know what the rules are going to be in the future. Every time we get a change of government, the rules change. It's not installing confidence within the system, and that's limiting it. They want to do the right thing, but they can't always do it, or they don't feel empowered to do it. And then we've got this challenge between a mismatch of the private costs that farmers incur to do this and the public good. And this is, I want to be very nuanced here because this, could be a little bit controversial. We live in a highly productive landscape. We've drained wetlands, we've cleared forests to make way for our farming and our cities. We've had private gain because of that. We've had national gain because of that. But those costs have accumulated down our rivers, and people can no longer use the rivers in the way that they want to because of individual action, but because of sort of state-sponsored individual action. So how do we fund this in a way that recognises that individuals have to look after their own externalities, but because of doing that, they're having a cascading benefit down the stream for the public good, for example, native fish conservation. Okay, so I'm just about to wrap it up. I'm getting a few nervous looks. So in terms of how do we scale it up from here? So farmers are already acting, which is awesome. They're already doing wetlands and nutrient management in the same breath. It's becoming part of the same conversation. They're no longer compartmentalised. But how do we scale it up? And for me, that requires regulatory confidence, some financial support, technical support, and getting enablement. So why are farmers having to pay tens of thousands of dollars for a consent to do something which is a net benefit? Farmers comprehend, they need to apply for a consent to take more water or to drain a wetland or to modify a wetland or something like that. But why are they spending tens of thousands of dollars before they even put a plant on the ground to do something of benefit? And so yeah, that's some of the headwinds that farmers are facing, and is sort of stifling that momentum that is starting to build out there. And that's me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So thanks very much, Justin, and we'll move on to our final speaker for this session, Richard Morris, based here at Lincoln University. Brings in the concept of landscape design, so spatial design, systems, ecology management. We've heard quite a bit about the importance of management and ongoing management. So I'll hand over to Richard.
Hi everyone. Thanks Justin for that. There's some interesting points that kind of segue into what I'm going to be talking about. Morena tātou, ko Richard Morris toko ingoa. I whanau mai ki Tokoroa in the North Island. He kai hohoa hau, me tā kuta putai o ahu whenua. I am an architect, plus I have a PhD in agricultural science, which may cause some cognitive dissonance in the audience when they hear that. But don't worry, I'm just as unbalanced and unhinged as that combination would suggest. For the last few years, then I've traded in my drawing board for geospatial analysis, working with GIS and the design of farm systems, particularly of nature-based solutions. So I'm going to talk today about a project we've been doing between the Centre of Excellence Designing Future Productive Landscapes here at Lincoln University and an iwi up in a portiki called Te Whakatohia, co-designing their intensive dairy farm. For the most of this, it's a work in progress. It's funded by MPI, and it's due in June, so it's sort of work in progress. But I'm going to talk mainly about the geospatial design aspect of the project. But before I do that, I just want to give you a bit of history about our connection with Te Whakatohia, because it's really important about how we built this relationship with this iwi. The research relationship goes back to 1994 when I was an undergraduate architect, and I saw this picture of Tāne Whirinaki, a wharenui, in the Journal of the Historic Places Trust, I was spellbound by this, and I had to learn more about it. And it's one of 7 wharenui constructed by followers of Te Kooti the rebel, or Te Kooti the prophet, depending on which way you look at it. And as the prophet, he inspired the Ringatu Church, Te Haki Ringatu, which is still one of the prevalent Māori Christian denominations in the Central and East and North Island. So I actually went down throughout my last 2 years of architect school, would hitchhike down to Auckland, from Auckland down to Opotiki, and take part in the Ringatu Rā, which are the monthly congregations of the Ringatu Church. They last for a couple of days. Actually, me and my 6-year-old son are going to one this Sunday. Over time, then we built up a trust and a friendship, and it's interesting that my relationship with Whakatohia was built on this extremely tapu background, and so I got a fairly good feeling of how far you can push things, how many questions you can ask, and where there are certain lines that you don't cross. Coming forward about 30 years, this is a very relieved looking Richard, having just defended my PhD. Pablo Gregorini, my supervisors there, Shannon Davis, head of school at the School of Landscape Architecture, she was a co-supervisor. But I was really blessed to have 3 senior kaumātua come down from Opotiki and be present at my defence. There's Robert Edwards here, 93 years young. Danny Pohipi, who's a tohanga, a basket of knowledge of environmental knowledge in the iwi. And this gentleman's Graham Reister, a Paki, who was actually playing for the first 15 at Lincoln College the year I was born. He's a Nuffield scholar as well. Okay, so our relationship has, with Te Whakatohia, has grown over the last 4 years. We've got 4 different funded research projects. We've got 2 MB Vision Matauranga projects, 1 Health Research Council project, which I think is the only time the Health Research Council has funded research at Lincoln University, and then this current MPI project. All of our work falls under this whakataiki called Tohe Oranga Wananga Whenua, which means hold steadfast onto health and learn from the land. And it's a nice way of encapsulating all the work we do. But with working with Whakatohia, one aspect becomes prevalent, and that is the situation of Raupatu. Raupatu is the confiscation of lands by the Crown in 1865. And that came especially out of our work with kai security. We're looking at spatial planning for kai security, and we learned a lot about how the iwi survived when they were put onto native reserves in the 1860s through to the 1880s, and had to survive on very unproductive land using their traditional knowledge. Basically what I'm saying is that this building up of an understanding and a relationship is more than just one saying. It's a layering of experience and understanding between the parties that's occurred over many years. Here is the Opotiki, and here is the iwi's dairy farm. Opotiki is built on the confluence of 2 really wild rivers, the Waiweka and the Otara. They have massive catchments and they're very unpredictable. Opotiki itself is a colonial settlement. It's just a perfect grid put onto a confluence of 2 rivers. Māori never had a permanent settlement here. They had Pākowhai, which is a small township which was seasonally intermittent. We've also got State Highway 2 running through the Waiweka Gorge, which at the moment is closed during the evenings. And we've got also State Highway 35, the East Coast Road, which is always getting closed due to repeated storm events. Over here we have a very large solar farm, which back in January was completely submerged with water. We have a new port facility here, which is about a $200 million Provincial Growth Fund investment, which the sea level rise modelling was done in 2008, and that's before climate adaptation even became part of engineering parlance. We have a municipal wastewater treatment plant, brand new one, which is failing. So Opotiki is a perfect case study for climate adaptation and the vulnerability of our coastal settlements. This is the Waiweka. This is the Whakatohia dairy farm. I've just rotated it 90 degrees so that we get a good fit onto the screen. The story with the Whakatohia dairy farmers, they brought this in the 1950s from some government money as compensation for land loss. At that time, this river, the Waiweka River, flooded here frequently, and I stood here with Uncle Robert Edwards, and he was telling me that this whole area used to be swamp before these stop banks were put in, duck ponds. So it was a very unproductive farm. 1964, you get a massive flood come through to a portiki. The water was up to the canopies of the shops. As a result, in the 1960s, the government put in huge amount of stop banks and the massive engineering exercises around the portiki. Overnight, then this turned into a highly productive farm, and that's been the economic cornerstone of Whakatohia since the 1950s. The one thing that, when I was standing here with Uncle Robert, though, is we know that from Bay Plenty Regional Council climate assessment guidelines that these stop banks all need to be raised about 2 or 3 feet, and there's tens of kilometres of them. There's no money to do that. So the question from the iwi is like, how are we going to keep farming this land when this river will eventually top those stop banks and do its own thing? And so it's all about how do we live gracefully with this weather, with this river that's under transition. So knowing that, we set about trying to understand the river and trying to design a new farm system for them, which can live gracefully with this changing river. So I'll run you through a few geospatial layers and explain how we've built up a design approach, if you like, to this issue. This is just a morphological map, which I call it, which is basically just looking at the pure landform. So we've got LiDAR in the black and white. LiDAR showing the old historic oxbows of the river. It's also showing quite a pronounced terrace. This is drop about 2 to 3 meters. So we've got an upper terrace here and a lower terrace here. And these are the stop banks just dotted in through here. Okay. Then we take that same LiDAR and we get right into the micro topology of the land. And we're looking at, these aren't streams, but this is where under a storm event, this is where water accumulates and concentrates and then flows across the land. So this is the secret sauce. This is radiometrics. This is data obtained from Land and Water Science, Clint Rissman, if you're familiar with him. So what Clint does is on this project is he drove his quad bike around, and every 5 meters he takes basically a Geiger counter reading of the gamma radiation coming out of the soil. It measures uranium, thorium and potassium isotopes, and from that we get a really clear picture of the age of the soils, and that tells us a lot about the weathering qualities of different soils, and that tells us a lot about how it holds on to nutrients and how it holds on to water. So we're starting to see from this, tells us a lot about what's happening underneath the surface, which explains what's happening on the surface. And this gives us a vast amount of intelligence when we start thinking about nature-based solutions. So then combining that radiometric data, the understanding of those nuanced qualities of the soil, plus the topography of the surface, plus the accumulation area of all the watersheds coming into the farm, we're able to come up with this map. And this is what I call an eligibility map or eligibility signal. It tells us not just about where we put nature-based solutions like wetlands, like trees, but where they're more likely to be suitable. So this is absolutely gold for a designer of nature-based solutions. What we've got here are the red areas which show high propensity to shed water, and the green areas are high recharge areas where the water is freely draining. And then the purple areas are these transition zones. It's where water's flowing from one to the other. So instantly we get a picture of not just the river, but the whole river system and how it's operating in conjunction with the river. So the iwi coming to us and asking us about how are we going to farm, how are we going to design nature-based solutions for the future dealing with this river. This gives us a much bigger picture of the river that we're actually dealing with. Okay. This also allows us, the same data allows us to work out where wetlands are likely to form. And again, it goes back to that question of wetlands are great, but you only want to put them in places where wetlands are going to survive and persist over time. Otherwise, you're into a whole lot of wasted resource and time. Okay, and the good thing is that we know that the data came up with these green splodges of where wetlands are likely. The good thing is that there's a huge wetland here, and there's a strong wetland emerging here. So that's great for ground truthing for our clients in Whakatō here. They can actually see that our data is resembling what they see in real life. So based on that, other members of my team have come up with a system approach to how the farm might be reorganized. At the moment, the whole thing is dairy farmed with some cropping going on up in that corner there just for silage. So we're moving all the dairy activity onto what we call a persistent platform dairy area, and that's where we can see that the ground is more suitable for heavy dairy, heavy cattle, and proposing to put a more light impact livestock, possibly dairy sheep, but that's hypothetical at the moment, down by the river on these soils, and then more focused on cropping for high value cropping as well as silage production on that area there. So this to me is, when I came to Lincoln, this is what I wanted to achieve, right? It's about looking at a landscape and saying, well, where can I put trees and wetlands and nature-based solutions with a scientific basis where it can actually work? It's not just about saying nature-based solutions are good, put them on here. Where do we put them and what configuration do we put them? So what I've got here are 5 different typologies, and I'll just run through quickly per zone what we're looking at. So for the closest area around the dairy shed, it's an area of transition, so we're just trying to stabilize the soil, but our main priority here is creating shelter for calving. This is a calving zone close to the dairy shed. This area is a mating zone, and it actually features quite a lot of, it's the next step back out from the dairy shed, but it actually features quite a lot of wetland. So I'm picturing these sort of romantic interludes with mating cows and wetlands and sort of romantic landscapes. So we've got the wetlands too. I've just given it a general hatch, but I think there's a lot of room incorporating the constructed wetland technology with berms and conduits of water, where we can actually regain quite a lot of this area within these wetland zones and still keep it as pasture, but still as a functioning wetland in and around the pasture at the same time. But again, the main planting is just really to stabilize these soils in transition and provide shelter from the southerly, which is the most dangerous prevailing in there. This is the conditioning zone, which is further out, and it has good recharge area. It's not so critical here because it's up on the higher terrace. And so the main driver here is the stock will be out there during the summer, so it's putting in these vegetation mainly for shade, for solar protection. So they're oriented north-south to cast shadows throughout the day. When we go down to the lower terrace, we get into much more complex hydrology, and this is where we start to see what we call recharge ribs, following the line of these interfaces between high recharge areas and medium recharge areas, so that these characteristics are preserved over time, because they all have an important function in the overall functioning of the river. And this is this is for flushing if this was a dairy sheep sort of operation. Interestingly enough, we've got a high recharge area right next to the Waiweka River. We haven't shown any vegetation here because our main concern here is subsurface flow, but it just shows that with riparian planting, it isn't always necessary to plant every single metre of the river. There are areas which are completely impervious to subsurface flow, so therefore riparian planting for that purpose is not really required. It could still be required as a biodiversity corridor or to skim off any phosphorus moving down. But don't forget, we still have a stop bank running along here. But these ones here are called river transition spurs, where we actually envisage one of these days that the stop banks will overflow. So in preparation for that, we'll start putting in planting either side of the stop bank, keeping back from the for compliance reasons from the stop bank, and fill them in over time, so that when the river does eventually top, the flow will be conducive to what the river wants to do. We've also got some clumps of trees in these high recharge areas, again, just to augment that recharge and slow the water running through those high recharge areas. When we go into the cropping area, really the main driver here is machinery and functionality. So we've kept it mainly clear. It's a high recharge zone, so we don't have any stock on it, so we're not so concerned about that aspect. It's really just to stabilize the soil and to work in with the mechanical harvesting of the crops. So just in summary then, this is the approach we're taking, is to understand first of all the characteristics of the landscape, because in this particular area, the main driver is hydrology, it's flood. And so we're really keen on looking at understanding the characteristics of the landscape from a recharge, from a runoff, and from a transition point of view. Then over top of that, we start putting functions which correlate to those different characteristics. And then over that, we start layering the actual physical NBS over the top of that. So this is, in summary, we're not looking at to try and optimize for one particular ecosystem service. We're trying to look at a farming system which works with the river in transition, but also allows us to keep on farming. It's not prescriptive in terms of us saying, here's where you must put things. This is a work in progress, so there's still a lot of flexibility in terms of where these actual zones will lie, and actually, what sort of species of trees we're going to put in. That's a whole new tranche of work we're doing now with incorporating which tree species go where. And it's not just an overlay design. We're not just saying to the landscape, ignoring what's underneath and just saying, this is the right thing to do. Will it work or won't it work? We're trying to take some of the risk out and trying to stop us doing dumb things. So sort of starting to think about working with the landscape behavior and then actually thinking with the landscape. So this is what potentially a layout of a farm with its woody vegetation and wetlands may look like in the future in order to keep on farming in this particular context. But I think it's important to bear in mind the long-term picture here. Okay, so this is a climate projection for 2135, so just over 100 years away. And you can see that the nice crescent of the Bay of Plenty is likely to be replaced with a more Marlborough Sound sort of convoluted shoreline. Now, some people might look at that and say, what the hell's the point of doing all these intermediary NBS exercises when we're just going to get washed away? And that's a fair enough point. Should we just like drill baby drill and just make the most of what we've got? Yeah, but we've got to remember that this is going to occur over decades. It's not like suddenly we wake up one day and we've got 20 feet of water. Yeah, this is going to be a problematic estuary for decades and decades. And so perhaps by listening to the landscape like what we're doing with these NBS and placing them according to the radiometric knowledge that we have, this opens up ways that we can work with that gradual transition in a graceful way. And in doing so and observing our results, we might figure out ways that we can actually keep farming when the land does eventually take on this shape. Thank you very much.
Thank you. If Justin can come back up, and we've got some minutes for questions, and Catriona's I think also still online.
Justin, how much progress could be made on if instead of spending $100 million on our land and water, we spend that money instead of what we sell it helping farmers?
$100 million with the gain at $3.50 a plant. Yeah, a lot of plants. Yep. I'm not sure if that was a very categorical question and answer, or you wanted to me to elaborate, but I think these are some.
I'm making the point, we spend a huge amount of money doing science on water pollution, when we already know the answers, we know what the problem is. We need to have some execution. We need to deliver solutions on the ground. Yeah, we're failing to do it.
Yeah. I think that's a fair point of at what point do we transition from creating more knowledge and more science in the absence of prioritising the money to action. But I also think Richard's case study here, which, you know, dare I say it, costs some money to do, has perhaps provided some valuable insights as well. So maybe it's, yeah, a little bit more nuanced and maybe a bit more balanced as well. Yeah, a fair question, I think, as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, again, question for Justin. So, and riparian planting, but what about the dairy cows with the urine patch on our gravelly and alluvial soils?
Yeah, so my presentation is very context dependent, and I did a wonderful get pulled up on this. So wetlands and riparian margins are extremely effective where you do have seeps and overland flow and shallow groundwater. Where it becomes drainage into deeper groundwater that then bubbles up somewhere else, that requires a different measures, and that's more the traditional, from a dairy perspective, cows, grass and irrigation. So your wetlands are not going to solve that particular challenge on the Canterbury Plains. However, you know, there could be like that example in the Murray. Murray Basin is very gravelly. The water goes down and the water comes up at a different part of the catchment. And a lot of catchment groups are now discussing how farmers in that community pay into a central fund to then apply mitigations on a different farm in a different part of the catchment where the problem is actually materialising. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Justin, again, are you doing any research to look at the, I suppose, the origin of some of the things that are spreading? So that, for me, that would be, let's say, in days of old, we have no urea, very limited phosphorus supply, and palm kernel would never be thought of. Are you looking at the physical and financial scenarios there to the ones that you're moving into?
Yeah, so there's still a lot of work, and Dairy NZ's very good, as well as other organisations and consultants at looking at that traditional feed farm system stuff. We're just trying to get this edge of field stuff more into the mainstream and not have it as a bolt-on, have it genuinely packaged up. So yes, long story short, a lot of work around feed type, feed quantity and fertiliser inputs and stuff like that. Yeah, yeah. So it's still there, it's still going on.
And we had one at the, yeah.
Richard, that kind of level, at farm level, I guess, context, wider context. Do you have views on who and how that kind of?
Yeah, good question. And we're doing that at catchment level. We don't go into the specifics of where trees are planted. We look more of what we do is we put a hexagon mesh over that catchment. So it's a much bigger scale. But that tells us where areas are eligible for wetlands, where areas are eligible for tree planting for riparian purposes. So it just says, if you've got a collection of farmers and you're saying, well, for the greater good of the catchment, where would be the key farms and the key points that we want to make a high leverage interventions, and then as a collective they can have discussions about, oh, we might lease that area of land off that farmer because that wetland is absolutely key for the prosperity of the whole catchment. So it changes from that sort of spatially explicit tree placement sort of scale just to a bigger scale that essentially tells you the same thing. And then you can zoom in once you've made those decisions and have a little bit more fun with actually locating trees and wetlands within that zone.
And we have that tool of Catrionis to help us with some of that as well. You could combine the two. Okay, if there's no further questions, I'd like to thank our three speakers. And again, we have a small gift. I'll get Katie to hand them out. I'm not quite sure how we're going to get them to Catriona, but one for Richard and Justin. If we can show our appreciation, please, that would be good. We're just going to take a 10-minute break. This is just for a quick stand-up, walk around, toilet break, and reconvene at 12 o'clock. So welcome back, everyone. For our final session, we have two speakers. We're looking at future-proofing profitable farming systems, aligning environmental performance with business success. I always believe you can't be sustainable unless you are also profitable. So our first speaker in this session is Professor Alan Rennick from Lincoln University, focusing his work on agricultural policy, innovation and value chains. He'll explore how farmers can remain competitive while improving environmental performance. And just to let you know, he was just recently flew back from the UK, so we're quite glad he actually managed to make it back, having been there for a conference and visiting family. So welcome back and thanks for being here.
Thank you, Alison. I guess two apologies to start with. First, I am still a little bit jet lagged, so I might even be more, for those that heard me before, I might be even more incoherent than I normally am. And the second one is I'm not actually sure I've kept to my brief either when I'm talking today. So I had a really interesting morning listening to those presentations, and actually I've been quickly sort of editing my talk as I've gone through to try and make it a little bit more in relation to what we've been talking about. But whilst we're looking at balancing science, policy and farm economics, I haven't really got much science in here other than perhaps the need for it in a sense to help inform us. But really where I'm kind of focusing on is thinking about how can we make the environment pay. And I think that was really sort of to me about balancing the farm economic side of things with the discussion today we have about enhancing biodiversity. Obviously, we know the environmental challenges associated with our farming systems, and unfortunately Matt's gone because I think I might challenge him that our greatest contributor to the environment is dairy, but unfortunately he's gone, so I can't do that. But we know the associated challenges with it. But we also know, and we've heard it a lot this morning, I mean, extensive, huge amount of work has gone on about how we can enhance sustainability in our agricultural sector, and some fantastic examples this morning, fantastic research going on right across New Zealand. So we know a lot about what we can do, and we know also that there's many different approaches to mitigating our emissions or enhancing provision of ecosystem services. And again, you know, I guess there's always that challenge when we talk about mitigation, and it's great to hear about repairing, you know, planting and wetlands and stuff. But I guess, you know, one fundamental thing you say, it'd probably be easier if we weren't producing this in the first place to have to mitigate it rather than mitigating. So again, it's at the source of where these challenges are, I think, important to us. So when we think about how we can make the environment pay, clearly, it comes back to our dependency, I think, on ecosystem services. Talked a lot about biodiversity this morning, a lot about water, but of course, we also know about provisioning, regulating, and cultural. But, you know, whatever we're talking about, these things, our native biodiversity in New Zealand is in fundamental crisis, right? You know, a third of our species are hugely challenging. You know, we've got a global crisis in this, so it's great that we're talking about biodiversity and adding, you know, in our waterways, etc. But we have a fundamental crisis in New Zealand in our native biodiversity. And yes, lots been done, but this crisis isn't going away from us in a long way. And clearly, also, we've still got, you know, major challenges in our catchments with excess contaminants. And again, we can overlay farming systems on that and discuss that. But, you know, we've got these fundamental challenges in our land uses, And really the question is, how do we think about ways that we can actually take this into account in our farming systems and take account of these, you know, I guess we'd say negative externalities that are coming out there to actually get land use which can enhance the environment but also be profitable for our land users. And I think some interesting approaches going on. This is the Aotearoa Circle's work on natural capital. I think it was around Hawke's Bay, was it the area they're looking at? I can't remember. But again, what I like about this work was that they took a natural capital approach to thinking about their land use and the reliance of all their economy, really, based on water, ocean, flora and fauna, land, soils. So they can obviously map straight onto our farming systems, but then of course the whole cascading impact down through our economy. And again, just highlights that fundamental importance of our natural capital to our overall economy, and we can't separate those out at all. I think, to me, the fundamental challenge when we're thinking about our land use is really this accounting for externalities. I was at a conference, not the one I've just been to, a conference earlier this year, where he kind of said, well, the problem with economists, all they fundamentally say it's a problem of externalities, and that's as far as they've got, and they're not really helping us, okay? And I thought my whole talk at that conference was about externalities and the problems are caused by it. So, but I still think we have a contribution to make into this. So, you know, this, I think, sort of sums up some of the challenges we have with our land use. So we have a current system, could be dairy, I'm not mentioning any names here, benefit to those ecosystem managers in here, a profitable system. But of course, we know there's costs to downstream populations and others coming with this particular land system, okay? But then we have another land use system, okay, and maybe a little bit of a stylized view because it hasn't got any of these negative costs, but it's less profitable to the land manager than that system. Of course, we don't have that land use system adopted, okay? It's just not profitable as the other one. But at the same time, it's saving society all these losses in and costs to downstream populations and others. So these are true costs, and we've got lots of estimates of the level of these costs. Can we think of a way where we can then take those costs, turn them into payments to this land use, which doesn't produce those costs to us, and actually make it more profitable so that we maybe have that land use and society will gain? You know, the maximum we can pay is the costs associated with our other ones, and we may not have to pay all that to make that land use profitable. And the challenge, I think, here is that, you know, these are true costs, true benefits. We're not taking this into account when we're making our decisions. So we're getting land uses where we're not taking those into account. Now, of course, what we've been hearing today a lot of, I think, and again, this is perfectly feasible, is that we can reduce these costs, negative externalities associated with the system, which is also another way of dealing with that challenge. And that's your, you know, wetlands, riparian planting, etc., etc. We can do that. But I think what I'm kind of thinking about, the question to me is, yes, we can improve dairy, but we're now in a situation, for the first time since I've been in New Zealand, 11 years now, we're talking about expanding dairy again, right? You know, especially consents in Canterbury. We're going to have major challenges associated with this, right? And I think we're going to have to think about our land uses and how we deal with it. But the issue again, what I'm saying is what we're hearing, what we've been hearing this morning, to me, is a fundamental polluter pays principle, right? The work that's going on dairy is fantastic, and those dairy farms are bearing the costs of their externality trying to remove it, and that's fantastic. And interesting, Justin's point about the financial assistance to farms doing that, and again, is what I'm going to come to. Where's the public benefit and where's the private benefit? But I would say what we're seeing are great examples of the polluter pay principle, right? Dairy farmers should be bearing the costs of ameliorating their externalities to society. That's one way you could look at it. But what I'm kind of think about more often, a bit more, is thinking about how can we make that environment pay then? So what we've seen today, and I think some great examples of that, is also the direct improvement in productivity that can occur to a farm by enhancing the yields, whether it's the shelter belts, the repair in water, less evapotranspiration, that sort of thing, the win-win, right? So there's win-wins for farms in enhancing the environment, and they're quite simple in a way, right? Because it's good for the farm, good for the environment, improves their profitability, they can do it. But the other way of doing it, I guess, is that if you can capture those credence attributes associated with the products, achieve higher prices, then again, we can see, and again, we could argue silver fern with the sort of pure nature approach to it, really working on the biodiversity enhancements, etc., with the beef and sheep sector to try and get those higher prices. But of course, we also have that other discussion whether actually the environmental credentials are no longer just about achieving higher prices, it's about actually getting access to markets, right? So again, that's so fundamental to us that we do it. But then when we're looking at this situation, again, where we've got public goods associated with provision of our agricultural systems, then maybe there is a role for government to pay the farmer for these public goods, right? Or another way of looking at it is that if the wider private sector gains from the provision of farmers of ecosystem services, whether it's biodiversity or water or whatever, then they should be paying for this. So I just want to talk briefly, really, for the talk about some of these approaches. And here we have another example from Muri. It's getting a lot of mentions today. So we've actually been working with Muri about developing that funding mechanism to actually raise the money to put the water wetlands in. And it's a really interesting project that's been going on. But they had this one on just this week, I think, highlighting where they've given 2 hectares to improve the water quality. And of course, I have this discussion with my wife a lot when we talk about alternative land uses, and we've talked about a lot of them being much more risky than dairy, etc. And her point is actually it's a lot more risky to stay where you are than to adapt to climate change and things. And I always kind of felt this was it. I just read this article from the BBC, another drought, extreme weather is killing our family. And then we have our friend's groundswell's approach to this as well, right? And again, the two just sort of sit there. But I think a lot of what we've been hearing today is, in a sense, it's in our own interest to enhance the environmental performance of our farms, to make them more resilient to these sorts of challenges that we get. So, consumer paying. And again, I think that went straight to the jugular here, said, fuck, consumers aren't interested in this. I wouldn't go as far as saying consumers are not interested. I can see his point about people eating a Kit Kat, and therefore it's Nestle that are showing the interest, not the person eating Kit Kat. But we can see quite clearly from our meta-analysis we did a few years ago of people's willingness to pay for credence attributes to farms, for particular for environmentally friendly animal welfare, grass-based food safety. We can see food safety actually was a particularly high one in the analysis as well, but we can see there is a willingness to pay there. But we also can see that this is then represented in a demand for particular products with these attributes, and we can map over time, and we've seen launch of more and more products with these credence attributes, particularly around environmentally sustainable, etc. But of course, at the moment, I think expecting consumers to pay more for these factors is pretty challenging for us. I mean, I think we all know we've got basically a food price crisis going on, and particular things are not going to be making us better at the moment. Our friend Donald Trump certainly creating things. And I just thought this was a very unscientific stuff poll I saw yesterday, but how long do you think fuel prices will remain high? 54% think these prices are going to last more than 6 months. We saw the very sad headline of Easter Bunny being scrapped for people because of the cash-strapped kiwis and stuff. So I think consumers paying for these credence attributes at the moment is particularly challenging for us. And we noticed in the 2008 food price crisis, when I was in Scotland, we were doing some work there at the time, and we noticed that the organic premium plummeted during that financial crisis. Interestingly, the premium for animal-friendly products actually remained, but the organic disappeared. So potentially challenges are going to be for expecting consumers to pay for this. So, you know, we always, going back to this graph, you know, people always say, well, this is what people say they're willing to pay. When you actually look at it, they buy on price, and that's always a challenge for us in this. So the next issue then really is about private companies pay. And this is some work that sort of highlighted, there's some analysis, some interesting work that's been trying to do to understand how dependent businesses are on natural capital, right, or nature dependencies. And this is out of a scale of 5. 0 means you're not dependent on it at all, and up to 5 means you're hugely dependent. And they've done some work looking at New Zealand businesses. These are really only a snapshot of ones where data is available. But as we can imagine, those involved in the food and fibre sector are highly dependent on natural products to do it, nature dependencies to do this. But if we move further away from that, so this doesn't come out very well, we can also see actually huge range of our industries are dependent. And it goes back to that work by the Aotearoa Circle, looking at the Hawke's Bay area and the dependency on there. It flows through into our whole economy. So the question then is, if we're dependent on this, then can the private sector actually help pay for land use that enhance the environmental performance, provide ecosystem services as well? And so I think the challenge there is, you know, how can we get that relationship from the dependency to actually paying for farmers to make those environmental performances, to put in land uses that actually give us that environmental enhancement. And of course, there's a whole range of ways this can occur for us. We could get foreign direct investment in, we could be using our KiwiSaver funds, we can be thinking about impact investment, as we said, the major industries, Nestle, Mars, etc. But what we can see with the challenges with this and this money flowing in to potentially go to help land use is scale is a large challenge for us, because we're talking today, a lot of the examples we've been talking about at the farm scale, but that sort of investment doesn't think at farm scale. You know, it thinks at thousands and thousands of acres or hundreds of millions of dollars that they're trying to invest in a large case, especially overseas investment. So again, how do we get the scale required to enable us to achieve this, I think, is a challenge from this. And if we think about the policy side, I think that, you know, it's the carrot and stick. I think it's a real challenge for us. Again, this is a range, some work that was done by Landcare, and they were Landcare quite a while ago, in 2014, just thinking about how we get protect ecosystem services. So we can go from outreach and education and that access, and that kind of makes sense when we're showing, I think a lot of the things we're showing today were win-win situations. And so why aren't we having these win-win things put in place? And that might be a lack of information, a lack of education, etc. And we can go through that. But then, of course, we can go to much more restrictive approaches, bans, or we can use economic instruments as well. And there's a whole range of policies in there. But what we fundamentally, I think we've got wrong at the moment in New Zealand, and the reason that we got the wrong land uses, I'm just going to say, I think we've got the wrong land uses in one way. If we're thinking about biodiversity and things like that, is we haven't got the balance of the carrot and stick right, okay? The incentives for people to do the right thing, being pushed by the government, are being pushed down the road, you know, moving out the emission trading scheme, thinking about fresh water, etc. Those incentives, which would help push us to a more environmentally friendly farming, the government's signalling, but we'll worry about that later, okay? And so there's no real stick going on to do this. And you could argue there's probably not much carrot either, but we haven't really got that balance. And I think, you know, again, when we talk about the end, it's getting those signals right actually is really important for the role of the government in this and looking at it. So yeah, use outreach and education where we've got win-wins, but where we've got externalities that we need to deal with, we do need some of the stick as well. But we're in, you know, again, just being back to Europe for a couple of weeks just reminds me how different Europe is. You know, they're spending 60 billion euros a year supporting agriculture, okay? And we look at where we are here on the on the chart of support to agriculture, basically nothing, okay, coming from here. Now, there's lots of issues around what's going on in New Zealand, UK, Europe, etc. But one thing they can do with that support is directed to providing public goods and environmental benefits, right? And it's just very difficult in New Zealand because we haven't got that situation. So I was talking to someone at the conference I used to know who left the society and went into farming 20 years ago. And he actually said, this year, I'm not harvesting anything on my farm. I've planted wildflowers, right? My harvest is wildflowers. And he did it through the SFI, which I can't remember what it's called now, new environmental schemes that have come up since they did Brexit. And basically they're paying from £592 to £732 a hectare each year to plant bird food. So it's such a different approach from the way we're doing here. But the government view when they left Brexit, when they left Europe, was that they would use this funding to provide public goods, right? And now there's a whole debate about food security and whether you should be doing this and stuff, but it's an interesting approach to paying for the environment. So really the last thing I kind of want to think about is how do we then monetarize these wider benefits? And we talked a lot, lots been talked recently about creating, we've got carbon markets, but can we create biodiversity credit markets for these missing markets? Because we haven't got the market for biodiversity that we do have for dairy, etc. Right? And again, there's lots of sort of idea about nature-based markets, biodiversity credits, ways to do that. And New Zealand's obviously moving a bit to a voluntary approach. And I think Australia has a voluntary approach at the moment. But again, the challenge is, and some of the science I think behind this, the research has shown, again, unless you've got an incentive for people to join the voluntary approach, it's not necessarily going to be accessible. You need the stick as well, which is why the carbon markets kind of work better than you have with the biodiversity ones at the moment. But again, can we monetarize biodiversity? Can we actually begin to show that value in a way which can then get back to the farmers and help with us thinking about making farming for nature more profitable? And again, government likes this because it doesn't cost government money, right? They just set the framework for the market and then let the market work. But again, the success of this is pretty hard to tell, and there's lots of challenges in this market. Katrina's talk, I think, about understanding the outcomes of the work, the biodiversity work, really fits into this work, isn't it? How do you know whether actions are actually enhancing the biodiversity? So we've got monitoring, validation, etc. problems, MRV problems. We've got challenges again at scale. What level are we working in these markets as well? But again, it shouldn't mean that we shouldn't stop them. I'm just saying we need to think about how we can make these work, and potentially there are a work. But again, the voluntary approach, it shouldn't be undertaken in a way, basically government has said, oh, well, it's a private market problem. We don't have to get involved. Actually, they've got quite a long role to play in this if it's going to be successful. So this is, I think, if you've heard me recently talk here, I've talked about this model before. This is about trying to support regenerative agriculture. And again, I think you've talked a bit about that earlier this morning. But what I like about this model to me is really, if we are going to make these alternative systems more environmentally friendly systems viable and at scale. And I think New Zealand should really grasp this. Again, I think we've got a lot of opportunities here to be world leading in these sort of models. We're a relatively small country, relatively small number of landowners, etc. We could really actually be a model of how we can make these biodiversity markets or profitability of farms actually really, really work. And they basically have a role for all these people around our markets here. I won't spend too long going through them all. I'll just put them up here. But right from banks, in the sense of actually preferential lending rates, sustainable finance. Again, so we talk a lot about philanthropy, actually helping change the system, people who want to buy the ecosystem services, biodiversity, carbon, etc. There's the role for food businesses to pay for the benefits associated with this. Insurance, many of these alternative systems may be more risky. Again, we talked a little bit about risk before, if you get the insurance right. Then again, what's the role for government in that? And that's getting the environment, the regulatory environment correct to be able to do this. But what I like about this model is I think it shows that we need a collaborative approach from right across the ecosystem that actually influences the land manager to try and get systems that make it actually more viable to have the farming systems which are enhancing ecosystem services. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. So, thank you, Alan. We'll move to our final speaker, Dr. Brad Howlett from the Bioeconomy Science Institute. We're switching away from our previous themes of, I guess, wetlands and riparian planting slightly. Benefits were mentioned in terms of insects, and Brad has particular interest in pollination and pest control. So we'll look at the beneficial insects. Over to you, Brad.
Thanks, Alison. Okay, great to be here to talk about a project that we've been doing, getting on to 5 years now. It's about designing native plantings for beneficial insects. Okay, so this project has involved a number of partners. It is a lot of land managers, farmers, farming industries, regional local councils and people that put plants in the ground. So we've all come together to look at beneficial insects and native plantings associated with that. Okay, so the Canterbury Plains is heavily modified, less than 0.5% of the remnant native habitat left. So typical of these farming systems, there's a lot of inputs. So pesticides to control insect pests, managed honeybees to pollinate crops. So across here on that further figure with the honeybee, this sort of demonstrates the system at the moment and what farmers rely on. Managed honeybees to pollinate a whole range of crops. So the problem with that is that if we lose this insect, that puts farmers at a really vulnerable place. There's a lack of resilience in the system. So our idea is to bring more insects, beneficial insects into the system to be able to provide extra services. So here I give a demonstration of pollination. It also is the same with regards to natural enemies as well. But if we take pollination, for example, if we can encourage a lot more insects into the systems as shown by these networks, so you've got the plants on one side and the crops on the other, that means if, say, you have a problem with honeybees 1 year, you're going to have all of these other insects providing the pollination. So that is a resilient system if we can get it there. So that'll make it resilient to things like climate, because you're going to have insects that are active on cool, cloudy days in the crops. And also it brings in more efficient species. So honeybees aren't always the most efficient pollinator. If we can get more diverse pollinators, there's a good chance we're going to get insects there that are going to be really effective. So our approach is to look at whether we can design, in our case, native plantings that are going to support these insects. We know overseas, there's quite a lot of evidence that semi-natural habitats on farms can support diverse beneficial insects, and that they can actually provide some benefit to the farm itself, like cropping and controlling pest species, so pollination and controlling pest species. But the problem is that not all semi-natural habitats produce the same result, and it can be really variable. And also from system to system, depending on what sort of insects you want to encourage. So our approach is to look at the native plantings we've got here in Canterbury, which plant species are going to work for a particular farm to support the insects to get those in on the farm and doing some work that's going to benefit the farmers. So let's look at the insects we're targeting. So the first group is the pollinators. Now in New Zealand, we have, as mentioned, managed honeybees in the Canterbury area are heavily relied on. We do have some exotic species and we do have some native bee species as well. So all of these we know can contribute to crop pollination. We also have a bunch of non-bee pollinators. In New Zealand, these can be particularly valuable. In terms of that value, if we look at our bees alone in New Zealand, we have relatively few species, only 28 native bee species. They can be really good pollinators, as I mentioned before. We've shown that 14.3% of the species are crop pollinators. But the problem with them is that if you look at this network with the different bees at the top and the different crops and the flowering ordered from early spring right through into autumn, you can see that the early flowers, early flowering crops, all we really have is honeybees and exotic bees that are going to contribute to that. That doesn't really leave a lot of options for growers. It's okay in the summer crops, the flowering crops like onion and pak choi. We've got a lot of diversity there, as you can see by how many bee species are interacting or visiting the onion and carrot crops, for example. So that's where flies come into being particularly important in New Zealand, because a lot of these flies will also be active in early spring as well. So we've got a little bit of a different, well, we need a different approach here in New Zealand because of that pattern and because of our pollinating species. The other group that we're focusing on are natural enemies. So there's two types. We've got predatory insects that attack generally quite a lot of different species that are often soft-bodied, like aphids and small caterpillars. So examples of that are things like hoverflies, lacewings and beetles. We also have parasitoid or parasitic insects like bristleflies and parasitoids. So they're particularly valuable for attacking specific pest species. Those ones are particularly diverse because they're more specialised on certain pest species. This is just an example of one of the natural enemies. It's actually a dual role. So the adult will pollinate crops, visits a wide range of native plant species. It's got a predatory maggot that will attack small caterpillars and aphids. Small caterpillars of some really valuable pests like diamondback moth and white butterfly. Okay, moving on to the native plants and whether they support these insects. So in the project, because we've got so many partners, it's meant that we've been able to look at a wide range of farms over up to 5 years now. I'm only going to talk about 3 boundary types. We looked at a few exotic ones as well. But in the discussion going forward, I'm going to focus on old native plantings, so those over 4 years old, new native plantings, those from 1 to 3 years old, and comparisons with bare fence lines. So we looked at bare fence lines on farms with native plantings that are at least 400 metres from native plantings, and also bare fence lines on other farms that didn't have native plantings. Generally, the results of bare fence lines on and off farms with native plantings produce the same result. So I'm only really presenting the on-farm bare fence line results. So we use various methods, as mentioned, window traps, sweep netting, to look at the insects that are associated with crops, the pollinators and the natural enemies. We used pak choi, flowering pak choi, that we place at these different boundary types, and we also used kale to look at natural enemies and pests. So they were in potted plants, so a phytometer arrangement. So if we look at the pollination side of things with the pak choi plants, what we see is up here, if you go down, these are the different years that we did this work. So 2021, 2022, sorry, 2022, 23, 24. And then across, we've got these are the old native plantings, and the insects that visited the native plantings throughout the day is based on the size of the pie. And each segment is a different type of insect species. Here are the new native plantings. Now here, the native plantings were 1 year old and going through to the 3 years old in 2024. And here's the bare fence line results here. So what we see is bigger circles up here, more segments in the circles, highlighting that the native plantings are having an effect of the insects visiting the pak choi in terms of more species and more abundant species compared to the bare fence lines. New natives did pretty well as well, surprisingly, given, you know, a lot of them weren't at the point of flowering. So that's one thing, we can get the insects there, and there's an association between native plantings and pollinating species. What does it mean in terms of seed set? So here we've got old native, new native and bare fence lines, the pak choi placed at those. In each one of these red dots at each site is where we hand pollinated and allowed insects to visit, so maximising the seed set. These green dots are just open pollinated, so the only thing was insects visiting them. And the slope between the two represents the yield deficit. So the really cool result here is that if you look at the slopes between the hand pollinated and open and just the open, plants near the native plantings hardly have a difference. So we're pretty much getting full seed set. If we look at new natives, it's a little bit all over the place. So not at a point that it's as stable as the old natives, but consistently at the bare fence line, we're seeing a yield deficit. As you can see, each year there's a slope that shows the variability between hand pollinated and open pollinated. So it's a really, really nice result. We can demonstrate that native plants on farms can support these insects and also get a benefit out of them. Pest-eating insects, so the natural enemies, we saw results that showed higher abundance of natural enemies at both old and new plantings compared to bare fence lines. So that's a really positive trend or result. For white butterfly, which was our dominant pest on the kale, we saw a lot higher parasitism at plants near the old natives versus near the bare fence lines. You can see there we were getting close to well over 50% parasitism of those butterflies. So really positive trends. We didn't get to the point where we could make recommendations to farmers in terms of whether that is, you know, whether you should change your treatment, you know, for pesticides, for example. And that's something we would really like to get to. Okay, so let's move on to native plant species and which ones are actually supporting these insects that we want. So over the whole period of the project, we looked at the common species that are usually established on Canterbury plantings, and down here are the beneficial insects that visit the flowers of those. So you can see here it's pretty huge. We observed more than nearly 70,000, recorded 857 unique interactions across 46 properties. But the really great thing is that our beneficial insects aren't that fussy when it comes to nectar and pollen. So you can see here the lines all move out across the whole range of these plant species. So they'll visit and utilise pollen and nectar from a whole range of species. But the other side is when we look at those species, they're also getting really high numbers of visitations of a lot of different species. So what that says to us on the Canterbury Plains is that if we're going to look at early flowering plants down here, early spring, compared to right through the summer through to winter, there's great opportunity to pull in plants throughout that period that's going to provide nectar and pollen resources for the whole life cycle period of these insects, or when they're active as adults. And you can see that, you know, a lot of these species are active over a long period of time. So there's potential to really use them across a whole range of crops. So now we're at the point of using that information to be able to think about design of these plantings. So I'll just play this because it's an interactive of how we're seeing this going in terms of helping farmers. So because we've got information plant by plant, we can estimate how many numbers, you know, what would be a really good number of plants of different species to be able to pull the insects that we're trying to bring into the farming system that will be good for that particular farming system, so we can get the balance right there. Then down here, in the yellow boxes, we've got the flowering time. So that means we can look at the flowering time of each species, pull those together so that we can optimize the nectar and pollen resources for these insects. So this example is currently at the flower visiting information. We also want to add pests and natural enemies to this based on other data that we've collected and build it up from there. Okay, so outcomes. So one of the big things that we want to do is get as much information out to farmers as possible. So with our the people in our governance group, those different organisations, we do have quite a lot of farmers that know about the project, who have been following the project, who hopefully have been learning about the project, which we'll find out in questionnaires, and delivering them lots of information about great plant species that are going to support beneficial insects, and also the insects and what the insects are and what their life cycles are like, and how to look for those insects and be aware what they are. Also, and this is probably the biggest culmination of the work, is we're developing a plant guide, which we hope to be out at the end of June. The idea there is that different farmers can look at what they're farming. So what is their crop type? What are the insects that are their key pests? What are the beneficial insects that are going to control their pests? Or what are the insects that are going to pollinate their crops? Identify the native plant species that are going to support those insects. And then be able to take that information to a planter, you know, to talk about, okay, these plants are going to be really good for my farm. Can you help me design that to be able to put in a really good planting for me, targeting the insects that I want? The information also includes quite a lot of information around the insects, some of the key insects themselves, their life cycles there, how to identify them in the field, what other aspects about their life cycle farmers need to be aware of to make sure that they're on the farms and they're not damaging their populations in other ways. Information around the different native plant species, where they grow, some of the limitations of certain species, so that it's a really sort of practical to use guide. Another thing that we're really interested in, and we're really kind of moving into this space a bit at the end of the project. So farmers may be aware of other native plantings on their farms that might be natural native vegetation, a remnant vegetation. It may be some native plantings that another farmer's done. Can they be able to look at that, value that, and think about other plants that they may be able to complement that to get the benefits for them? So an example is actually happening today. We've got someone from ECAN working with a seed industry partner, and they're designing the braided river to support biodiversity along the Braided River, but having plants also along the edge that is going to support the neighbouring farm as well. So that's an exciting development of two partners working together based on inclusion of this information. So into the future, we've got some short-term goals. Get that plant guide out, do field demonstrations of how to use it, try and gather a bit more data that can support a cost-benefit analysis, particularly around the natural enemies and what that means for pesticide use. Medium term, we're looking hopefully to develop a new PSGF funded project, so that's an MPI funded program, looking at how well our designs, the anticipated benefits are realised on different types of farms. Also figuring out how much planting would be needed to maximise the benefits of native plantings for beneficial insects. Look at guides for other regions, getting that information there that we can actually go beyond Canterbury to other regions and provide them with information. And then there's also information about, that's still outstanding, about interactions of pests and natural enemies, how effective those natural enemies are, and also certain aspects around life cycles we still lack. So there's some of the things going forward. Okay, so that's me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I can ask Alan to come back down, and we've got a few minutes for questions for Alan or Brad.
I noticed that fibre and tenure just have like one little line for one pollinator. Have you got any theories as to why
Okay, so the interesting thing is we've got data that it's actually a few more species, but it's still really low, like compared to the others. I suspect it's more nocturnal, so like it has a strong sense. So obviously it's trying to attract insects. So having talked to someone, they also think it's nocturnal. Well, so this is one thing, we haven't looked at the nocturnal side, or we don't understand how well they pollinate crops as well. So we're dealing with diurnal pollinators. So someone can take that up and explore that.
Brett, can I just ask you a question? When you're looking at your, I think, final thing about how you can provide stuff for farmers, I mean, I guess my concern is how would this fit in with a training or education of farmers about integrated pest management and understanding, you know, if they're going to spray, right, they're probably going to kill everything, and therefore it's not going to have that benefit. But,
yeah.
So you can tell them what plants they should have there to attract them, but then doesn't it need to be a whole extension bit about integrated pest management to make the most of it?
Yeah. So I think this is a real common problem that Foundation for Arable Research has identified. And also just the cost benefit analysis itself. Like I mentioned, we're not at that point. So I think, you know, farmers are really interested, the ones that we've dealt with trying to boost these insects. So I think they'll do it, but whether they'll implement, they're going to risk implementing it. So we need that sort of transitional stage to demonstrate. And, you know, that farm that I talked about where ECAN and so they're doing a trial farm. So we may be able to actually test those things of, okay, yes, we're really confident, you know, you can get away without spraying.
Right.
Can I remind you to say who you are and where you're from, even though I know? Can I remind you to say who you are and where you are from?
Not really. We've focused on, so there are other people that have looked at exotic plants, more around the benefits that they can provide for honeybees and also natural enemies as well. But we've had a really focus on the native plantings, because native plantings are they're being established in the environment anyway, and we demonstrate that we can get benefits out of them. So working with the opportunity to incorporate them with all the other benefits is a real goal, I think. So I don't know whether we really, well, it's still an outstanding question of, okay, can we get away with just native plantings for all of our insects? I'm pretty confident with pollinators. A lot of the exotic pollinators that are really great crop pollinators will visit all of these plants. But probably a little bit more work needs to be done on beneficial on natural enemies.
Brad, just bring up on that comment about taking outside cropping. I think that, yeah, I'm totally embrace the idea of native planting and also looking at other sources of biocontrol agents, especially things like Argentine stemweed or COVID biocontrol agents. The big issue I feel is the fact, under grazing systems, particularly intensive grazing systems, there is that risk that, it just like it creates a clean sweep, every time you put the cows through or your sheep, intensive systems, say cows every 20 days, you're just completely disrupting the biocontrol that are there. And so I think it's going to be an interesting challenge, not insurmountable, but it's something that would be great to look at.
Yeah. So all of these sorts of other variables are, a complication. And, even say dairy farms, it's not all just pasture, it's kale crops and how they work the kale crop. So all of these variabilities are, things that would be really great to explore. I think getting a stable population of these beneficial insects on farms is at least getting a nucleus population that can potentially support, pest control or pollination more quickly than if you didn't have them there, or if you didn't take action to get them there.
I've just got to apologise, Mark McNeil. I think we should control size.
Thank you. And the final question to Murph.
Yeah, thanks very much, Brad. Just picking up on that last point there, you talk about building up that kind of nucleus. If you've got a farmer who's kind of really focused saying, I just want more stuff that's going to pollinate my carrot crop, are they going to actually miss out on the fact that they're not building up that wider repertoire effect?
Sorry, I didn't quite get it. So they're
really focused on just one benefit.
Yeah.
Are they going to miss out on support in wider diversity and also
potentially
keeping through the entire year?
Yeah, potentially. I mean, one of the things is that you take cropping farms. Usually, it's not one crop. So I think farmers will generally be saying, "Look, I want pollinators for all my crops." They'll be looking at that. And the other sort of thing that's really great that puts us on safe ground is, you look at that network and all of the beneficials are visiting all of those plant species. So I think it's going to be easy to be able to provide benefits for, a wide range of pollinated crops.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank our two speakers for session 3, and as well, we've got a little gift for them. And then I will just very briefly, before lunch, do a quick wrap up. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I just wanted to say thanks very much for coming and for asking questions. It's a lot more interesting if questions are asked. I think we've picked up that there's quite a lot of interest in moving beyond farm scale science and plot side of things to the catchment scale. With that, we have Richard who talked about landscape design and the bigger picture there. We've got lessons around within paddocks, what we can do there. and within paddock across scale potentially. We've got edge of field solutions. We've got the need to have farmer buy-in, but with that farmer buy-in we have to consider both the initial investment that might be made and the requirements for ongoing maintenance. We're experiencing that on some of our own farms in terms of what we put in and the need for ongoing maintenance, which isn't necessarily already thought about. We've heard about soil, we've heard about water, we've heard about shelter belts, riparian planting, wetlands, and latterly pollination and pest species. And we've had indications from scientists, but also our farmer, that they do provide financial benefit as well as environmental benefit. And I think going forward, our next concern, I guess, is getting that implementation and the facilitation of implementation, and not just with the guidance and tools, but with the extension that is required. So I think New Zealand's doing a good job. It continue to do a good job. Will continue to try and do a better job, and we'll keep access to our markets. So I'd like to thank all our speakers, Al Black, Rick Stuffles, Matt Ironmonger, who unfortunately had to leave, Catriona McLeod, who obviously online won't be joining us for lunch, Justin Kiddo, Richard Morris, Alan Rennick, and Brad Howlett. If we can show our appreciation, that would be much appreciated. I'd also like to very much thank Katie Browning. Without her, this event wouldn't be happening. She's the one that did all the work. I just had to rock up this morning and hold a microphone a couple of times. So thank you, Katie. And if you would like to join us for lunch, lunch should be available out there now. Continue to network and ask questions. And thank you for being part of the innovation series, both our audience and our speakers.